Hello everyone, and welcome back to Mr. Sleepy Crime. I know many of you enjoy listening to these stories as you fall asleep. So before you drift off, I'd love for you to leave a comment letting me know where in the world you're tuning in from. And if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps the channel grow. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that these stories involve real people and real tragedies. We tell them not for entertainment, but to remember the victims and perhaps help others recognize the warning signs that could prevent similar tragedies. For the best experience, feel free to lower the volume a little, just enough to let the story gently carry you off to sleep. Alright, please get comfortable, dim the lights, and let's dive into tonight's first story. Tonight, we're going to explore a case that unfolded on what should have been the most romantic day of the year. It's a story about a young mother, an immigrant chasing the American dream, and a relationship that turned deadly. This is the story of Ellie Tran. Ellie Miziane Tran was born and raised in Hue, Vietnam. One of 6 children in a close-knit family, the ancient city of Hue, with its imperial history and winding perfume river, had shaped her early years. But like many young Vietnamese, Ellie dreamed of opportunities beyond her homeland. About 10 years before her death, she made the journey to North Carolina after marrying a Vietnamese-American man. The marriage didn't last, and after the divorce, Ellie found herself starting over once again. She moved to Virginia Beach, a coastal city where the Atlantic Ocean meets the Chesapeake Bay, a place known for its military presence and thriving Vietnamese community. Ellie was a survivor, a woman who knew how to rebuild. She found work as a manicurist, a profession that allowed her to use her skills while connecting with people. She worked at Deluxe Nails and Spa in Virginia Beach, and later at H&L Nails and Tan Spa in Norfolk. The work was hard, the hours long, but Ellie was determined to create a stable life. Then, in the spring of 2014, something wonderful happened. Ellie discovered she was pregnant. Her parents, Wani Letz and Kiowan Tran, who were still living in Vietnam, made the decision that would change everything. They would leave their homeland and move to America to help their daughter raise the baby. For Wani Letz, a 64-year-old woman who had spent her entire life in Vietnam, this was no small sacrifice. But family came first. Ogan remembered those precious months before the birth, rubbing her daughter's growing belly with anticipation and joy. And when baby Jolie was born, she became the center of everyone's world. Ellie was a devoted mother. Her parents would later describe how she never tired of playing with Jolie, spending hours on the floor of their toy-covered living room, teaching her daughter colors, shapes, and the alphabet through developmental games. The little girl was her mother's world, and Ellie's face would light up whenever Jolie was near. As the primary earner for the household, while her father worked part-time in a restaurant kitchen, Ellie carried the weight of supporting not just her daughter, but her parents as well. But she never complained. This was the life she had chosen, the family she was determined to protect. The home they shared on Still Meadow Court in Virginia Beach was modest, but filled with love. It was near the intersection of Salem and Dam Neck roads, in a quiet neighborhood where Ellie felt her daughter could be safe. But there was a shadow hanging over this seemingly peaceful home. That shadow had a name: Joseph Vincent Merlino III. Joseph Merlino, who went by Joey, was 29 years old when he entered Ellie's life. He owned a cell phone repair business at the oceanfront section of Virginia Beach, renting space on Mediterranean Avenue. To outward appearances, he was a young entrepreneur trying to make his way in the world. The details of how Ellie and Joey met, or when their relationship began, remain unclear. Even Ellie's parents weren't entirely sure when the romance started. What they knew was that it existed, and that it resulted in the birth of their granddaughter, Jolie, in 2014. For a time, it seemed like things might work out. But by the spring of 2016, something had shifted. The relationship fractured, and Ellie and Joey went their separate ways. Except Joey Merlino wasn't ready to let go. After the breakup, Jolie primarily lived with her mother and grandparents, though she did visit her father. This arrangement wasn't enough for Merlino. By the time Ellie died, the former couple was embroiled in a bitter custody battle, with a court date scheduled for March 27. But the custody dispute was only part of the story. What Ellie's family began to realize was that she was afraid, deeply, genuinely afraid. In December 2016, something happened that should have been a warning of what was to come. Ellie was outside the nail salon where she worked when she was attacked. An assailant disguised as a woman approached her and threw a caustic substance in her face. The attacker then tried to inject her with something. Ellie managed to run back into the salon for help. She went to the hospital and reported the incident to police. To her coworkers and friends, she was convinced of one thing. The disguised attacker was Joey Merlino. Police collected security footage from a neighboring business, but no charges were filed at the time. The investigation seemed to stall, leaving Ellie in a state of heightened anxiety. She knew she was being targeted. She knew someone wanted to hurt her, and she was terrified it would happen again. That's when Ellie made a decision that would later prove crucial to the investigation. She had surveillance cameras installed around her home on Still Meadow Court. If someone came for her again, there would be evidence. There would be proof. She had no way of knowing that these cameras would capture her final moments. Tuesday, February 14th, 2017, Valentine's Day. A day meant for love, for romance, for celebration. For Ellie Tran, it would be the last day of her life. That day, Ellie took little Jolie on a walk around their neighborhood. It was a beautiful moment between mother and daughter, and they took a photo together. Neither of them knew it would be their last. The day passed as so many others had. Ellie went to work at the nail salon, her hands moving skillfully over her client's nails, making small talk and offering smiles even as worry gnawed at the back of her mind. As evening approached, Ellie headed home. Her mother, Oanle, was waiting for her. They had planned to eat dinner together, a simple family meal at the end of the day. It was around 8 o'clock in the evening when Ellie's car pulled into the driveway of the home on Still Meadow Court. The surveillance cameras she had installed were running, capturing everything in the growing darkness. Owen was in the kitchen when she heard something that made her blood run cold, her daughter's screams. Ellie had stepped out of her car and was walking toward the front door when a figure emerged from the shadows. The person moved quickly, purposefully, rushing up behind Ellie before she could react. The attack was swift and brutal. The assailant grabbed Ellie from behind and plunged something into her leg. On the surveillance footage, you could see Ellie's body react, see the moment she realized something terrible had happened. Olean rushed to the front door and found her daughter in the driveway, unable to walk, crying out in pain and fear. As Olean would later testify, Ellie managed to say something through her agony. "I don't know what Merlino stringed in my leg. It hurts so bad. It's numb, even in her pain." Even as her body was beginning to shut down, Ellie knew who had done this to her. Someone saw him too. After the attack, she looked across the street and saw a figure she recognized. Joey Merlino. Ellie managed to call 911 herself. On the recording, she could be heard saying, "Somebody shot me." But she was confused, disoriented. She didn't know exactly what had been done to her, only that something had pierced her leg and her body was failing. Within 15 minutes of the injection, Ellie became unconscious. Her condition deteriorated rapidly. She was rushed to Santara Princess Anne Hospital, where doctors worked desperately to save her life. But whatever had been injected into Ellie's leg was already coursing through her system, shutting down her vital functions one by one. By midnight, doctors had devastating news. Ellie was brain dead. She held on for one more day, her body sustained by machines, while her parents and daughter tried to comprehend the incomprehensible. Little Jolie, just 2.5 years old, saw her mother lying there in terror and pain, an image no child should ever have to witness. On Wednesday, February 15th, 2017, Ellie Mizan Tran died. She was 35 years old. The medical examiner would later confirm what investigators already suspected. She had been poisoned with cyanide. Cyanide is one of the most lethal substances known to man. It works by preventing cells from using oxygen, essentially suffocating the body from the inside out. In high enough doses, it can kill within minutes. Ellie had been injected with enough to ensure she wouldn't survive. The day after Ellie's death, on Thursday, February 16th, police arrested Joseph Vincent Merlino III. He was 29 years old and was charged with second-degree murder. He was held without bond in the Virginia Beach jail. The evidence against him seemed overwhelming from the start. There was the surveillance footage showing the attack. There was Elaine Lane's testimony that she saw Merlino across the street moments after her daughter was attacked. There was a longtime neighbor of Merlino's who also identified him as the assailant seen on the video. But Merlino's attorney, Richard Dumar, had a different story to tell. According to the defense, Joey Merlino couldn't have committed this crime because he wasn't even in Virginia Beach at the time. Dumar claimed that Merlino had left Virginia Beach on Sunday, February 12th, 2 days before the attack. He had driven to Victoria, Virginia, about 2.5 to 3 hours away, to visit his mother and half-brother, Alexander Armstrong. On the way there, Merlino had hit a deer with his car, causing damage that left the vehicle overheated and barely functional. According to this version of events, Merlino was stranded in Victoria, unable to make the drive back to Virginia Beach. He was at his brother's house when Ellie was attacked, and witnesses could confirm it. But as investigators dug deeper, they found troubling evidence that contradicted this alibi. When police searched Merlino's home and business, they found materials to make explosives and multiple guns. The search was serious enough that a SWAT team was deployed, closing down streets for days. They also discovered something else. Merlino had purchased a plane ticket to China, where he had a fiancée. He was in the process of liquidating his assets. It appeared he had been planning to leave the country. And then there was his computer. When forensic investigators examined Merlino's laptop, they found a series of searches that painted a chilling picture. In late January 2017, just weeks before Ellie's death, someone using his computer had searched for information about cyanide. The searches included questions like, how much cyanide does it take to kill someone? There were also searches for syringes. The December 2016 attack on Ellie was also reopened for investigation. Forensic experts began analyzing the caustic substance that had been thrown in her face, looking for connections to materials found in Merlino's possession. And there was another discovery that seemed almost too damning to be real. During a remodeling project at Merlino's oceanfront business on Mediterranean Avenue, a bottle of clear liquid fell from construction debris and broke open. Preliminary tests indicated it was dimethyl sulfoxide, commonly known as DMSO. DMSO is typically used medically to treat certain bladder conditions, but it has another property that makes it particularly sinister. It enhances the absorption of other drugs or chemicals through the skin. As one poison control expert explained, when you dissolve a drug with DMSO, it helps take that drug across the barrier of the skin. It's a potent solvent. Why would a cell phone repair shop owner have DMSO hidden in the walls of his business? The FBI also became involved in the investigation. Special Agent Wendell Cosenza testified about Merlino's cell phone activity in the days before and after the attack. His phone pinged off cell towers near Victoria, Virginia on February 13th and February 15th, but crucially there was no outgoing cell activity from his phone on February 14th, the day of the murder. Had he deliberately turned off his phone to avoid creating a digital trail? As Merlino sat in the Virginia Beach jail awaiting trial, he did something that would prove devastating to his case. He began writing letters. These weren't ordinary letters. Merlino wrote to his girlfriend in China, but he wrote in code, apparently believing that this would keep the contents secret from authorities monitoring his jail correspondence. He was wrong. The FBI brought in a cryptanalyst, an expert in breaking codes and encrypted messages. This expert decoded Merlino's letters, revealing their true contents. In these coded messages, Merlino had been giving his girlfriend detailed instructions. He was directing her on how to create a fake web chat alibi for him, a fabricated digital conversation that would place him somewhere other than Virginia Beach on the night of February 14th. He was trying to manufacture evidence to support his innocence, but in doing so, he was actually creating evidence of his guilt. The letters revealed a man who knew exactly what he had done and was desperately trying to escape the consequences. They showed planning, deliberation, and a consciousness of guilt that would be impossible to explain away. By June 2018, more than a year after Ellie's death, Joseph Merlino's case finally went to trial in Virginia Beach Circuit Court. It would be a 4-day trial that would determine whether he would spend the rest of his life in prison. But the trial almost didn't happen at all. Before jury selection even began, Merlino told the judge he was not satisfied with how his attorneys had handled his case. He asked for a continuance. The judge denied the request. Merlino would go to trial as scheduled. There was another complication. Merlino had been on a hunger strike in the Virginia Beach City Jail. For 79 days, he refused to eat, losing about 40 pounds in the process. The hunger strike ended on July 4th, shortly after the trial began, but it had taken a visible toll on his health. The first day of trial was consumed entirely by jury selection. The case had received extensive media coverage, and some potential jurors expressed concerns about the violent nature of Ellie's death and their ability to remain impartial. On day 2, the prosecution began presenting their case. The centerpiece of their evidence was the surveillance video from Ellie's home. The courtroom fell silent as the footage played. You could see Ellie getting out of her car, see the figure rushing up behind her, see the moment the injection occurred. For Ellie's family, watching this video was torture. Waniel became so emotional at one point that she had to be taken out of the courtroom. Through a translator, Awning testified about what her daughter had said after the attack, about seeing Merlino across the street, about the fear that had consumed Ellie in the months before her death. The prosecution called a doctor from the University of Virginia, who testified about the effects of cyanide and how easily it could be converted from a solid to a liquid form. The testimony painted a picture of a poison that was both readily available and devastatingly effective. Then came the computer evidence. A detective with the Virginia Beach Police Department, an undercover officer and computer expert, took the stand. He revealed the searches found on Merlino's laptop, queries about cyanide, about lethal doses, about syringes, all made in late January, just weeks before the attack. The FBI's cryptanalyst explained the coded letters, walking the jury through how Merlino had tried to manufacture an alibi from his jail cell. When the prosecution rested its case, it seemed nearly insurmountable, but the defense had their own witnesses to call. The most notable was Alexander Armstrong, Merlino's half-brother. Armstrong, who had previous felony convictions for carnal knowledge of a child and failing to register as a violent sex offender, testified that he had seen his brother on the morning of February 14th, when he left for work, and then again around 9:30 that evening. According to Armstrong, this timeline wouldn't have left enough time for Merlino to drive to Virginia Beach, attack Ellie, and return to Victoria. He also testified that he was asleep when his brother got home that night, and that he didn't believe the man on the surveillance video was his brother. The figure had a bushier beard and what looked like a bald spot, he claimed. And then, in a dramatic moment, Joseph Merlino took the stand in his own defense. When questioned by his own attorney, Merlino was calm and direct. He even became emotional at one point, with tears forming in his eyes as he read letters he had written to his girlfriend in China from jail. He told the jury he had no involvement in Ellie's death. He explained about hitting the deer, about being stranded in Victoria, about his car overheating. When his attorney asked him directly if he killed Ellie Tran, he said no. When asked if he had made the searches for cyanide on his computer, he said no. But then came the cross-examination. Prosecutor Mario Lorello was relentless. His calm demeanor changed immediately, and there were several heated exchanges between the prosecutor and Merlino. Lorello poked holes in Merlino's testimony, questioning how anyone else could have made those searches on his personal laptop. He went through the coded letters, pointing out how they showed a man who was responsible for the crime and trying to fabricate evidence. When Lorello played the surveillance video again during his closing statement, he addressed Armstrong's claim about the bald spot. He showed the jury that it wasn't a bald spot at all, but a glare on the video. As the footage played, you could see the spot move away from the assailant's head. Lorello argued that Merlino had purposely worn a reflective vest during the attack, knowing it would create a glare and distort the camera's resolution. It was yet another sign of premeditation. At the end of his argument, Lorello displayed a photo of a smiling Ellie on an overhead projector. He looked at the jury and said, "This defendant murdered her in a vicious, horrible way. Be her voice because she doesn't have one anymore." On Friday, June 22nd, 2018, after 1.5 hours of deliberations, the jury returned with their verdict: guilty of first-degree murder. Merlino shook his head slightly when the verdict was read, but otherwise showed no reaction. His mother, who had attended all of his court appearances, was not in the courtroom. Ellie's family and friends teared up and hugged prosecutors afterward. After more than a year of waiting, there was finally a measure of justice. The following Monday, the same jury reconvened to decide Merlino's sentence. They spent only about 15 minutes deliberating before recommending the maximum punishment: life in prison and a $100,000 fine. During the sentencing phase, Ellie's older sister Phi Tran, who had traveled from Vietnam, delivered emotional testimony. She wept as she told the jury how her family had been devastated by her sister's murder. One of the most difficult parts, she explained, had been trying to answer the questions posed by Ellie's now 3.5-year-old daughter, Jolie. The little girl had seen her mother after the attack, lying on the floor in terror and agony. She kept asking where her mommy was, why she wasn't coming home. How do you explain to a child that her father killed her mother? Justice has been made under American law. Fitron said through her tears. We just want to say thank you. Thank you so very much. The formal sentencing was initially scheduled for September 26, 2018, but was postponed and rescheduled for early December. While trial judges can issue lesser sentences than jury recommendations, such moves are rare. It seemed certain that Merlino would spend the rest of his life behind bars. But then something strange happened. On Wednesday, December 5th, 2018, Joseph Merlino was scheduled to be formally sentenced. Just 1 week earlier, he had given an interview to local media from jail, appearing to be in good health and spirits. He said he was focused on his appeal and believed he would get a new trial. From what I'm reading, it should be an automatic reversal, he had said confidently. He told reporters he had no reason to kill Ellie. We weren't divorced or anything like that. There wasn't anything bad going on between us. We just had a few disagreements, he claimed, minimizing what had actually been a bitter custody battle. But on the morning of his sentencing, something was very different. When Merlino was brought into the courtroom, he was on a gurney-like wheelchair. His eyes were closed. His mouth was open. He could be seen shaking uncontrollably. He appeared to be foaming at the mouth. A jail deputy testified that Merlino had begun showing symptoms of an illness around 8 o'clock that morning, about an hour and a half before the sentencing was scheduled to begin. This came out of nowhere. Assistant Commonwealth's attorney Mario Lorello said, "The judge called for a doctor to examine Merlino." The Commonwealth attorney asked a pointed question. Was Merlino malingering? Was he exaggerating or feigning an illness in order to escape the sentencing? The jail spokesperson, Kathy Hyatt, noted that Merlino hadn't been on meal monitoring for quite some time, suggesting he wasn't on a hunger strike. She also stated that institution officials had no knowledge of any previous medical conditions that could have explained what they were witnessing. After seeing Merlino's condition and consulting with medical personnel, the judge decided to continue the sentencing hearing. It was postponed to Monday, December 10th. For those who had been following the case, the timing seemed suspicious. After maintaining his health and confidence right up until the day of sentencing, Merlino suddenly suffered from mysterious symptoms that left him seemingly unresponsive. Was this a genuine medical emergency or a final attempt to delay the inevitable? On Monday, December 10th, 2018, Joseph Vincent Merlino III appeared in court once again, this time without incident. The judge imposed the jury's recommended sentence, life in prison. Even as he heard the words that would end his freedom forever, Merlino maintained his innocence. This was an erroneous conviction, he declared. Time will always tell. He announced his intention to appeal. But for Ellie's family, the nightmare was not quite over. The custody battle for little Jolie continued. Both Ellie's parents and Merlino's mother filed for custody of the child. Jolie had been living with her maternal grandparents, Wanalogtrian and Thuentran, since her mother's death, and they were determined to keep her. They had already lost their daughter. They couldn't bear to lose their granddaughter too. For Olang and Thuan, every day with Jolie was bittersweet. They loved her fiercely, but every time they looked at her face, they saw their lost daughter. Olang had told reporters early on, "I have to love her more now because she doesn't have a mother." Jolie, who was now 3.5 years old, continued to ask about her mommy. When the doorbell rang, she would call out for her, hoping that her mother would walk through the door. Olang would tell her that mommy was sleeping, unable to find the words to explain the full truth to such a young child. The community had rallied around the family. A GoFundMe page was created to help with expenses. The Vietnamese community in Virginia Beach and friends from both near and far provided support. Orange's childhood friend had even flown in from Denver to be with her in the aftermath of the tragedy. But no amount of community support could fill the void left by Ellie's absence. Ellie Mizantran was a wonderful daughter and a caring mother. That's how those who knew her chose to remember her. Not as a victim, not as a crime statistic, but as a person who loved deeply and worked hard to build a life for her family. She had crossed an ocean to find a better life. She had survived divorce and started over. She had brought her parents to a new country so they could share in the joy of raising her daughter. She worked long hours in nail salons, using her skills to support the people she loved. She was 35 years old when she died, killed by the father of her child on a day meant for love. The case raised troubling questions about domestic violence and the systems meant to protect victims. Ellie had been attacked once before in December 2016, and she had reported it to police. She had installed security cameras because she knew she was in danger. She had told her coworkers and friends that she believed Joey Merlino was trying to hurt her. And yet, despite all these warning signs, she couldn't be protected. The surveillance footage that captured her final moments was only possible because Ellie had taken matters into her own hands. In the end, it was her own foresight that helped bring her killer to justice. The premeditation in this case was chilling. The internet searches for cyanide and lethal doses. The DMSO found hidden in his business. The coded letters attempting to manufacture an alibi. This wasn't a crime of passion or a moment of rage. This was planned, calculated, and executed with cold precision. The motive? Prosecutors believed it was the custody battle over their daughter. Joseph Merlino couldn't accept that he might lose access to Jolie. Rather than working through the courts, rather than finding a way to co-parent peacefully, he chose the most final solution possible. He took away Jolie's mother. He left a little girl without the woman who loved her most in the world. He devastated a family who had already sacrificed so much to be together. Today, Joseph Vincent Merlino III is serving a life sentence in a Virginia prison. His appeals have gone nowhere. The evidence against him was simply too strong. The case too carefully built. Little Jolie is growing up with her grandparents, who love her with all the devotion they once showed her mother. She's being raised in the Vietnamese American community that embraced her family, surrounded by people who remember Ellie and make sure her daughter knows what an extraordinary woman her mother was. As for Oan Lee and Phuan Tran, they carry on. They left Vietnam to help raise their granddaughter, and they're fulfilling that promise every day. It's not the retirement they had imagined, and the circumstances are heartbreaking, but they do it with love, because that's what Ellie would have wanted. That's what any good parent would want, for their child to be loved and safe and surrounded by family. On Valentine's Day each year, they remember a daughter who was taken too soon. They remember a mother who would do anything for her child. They remember Ellie, and perhaps in some small way, by telling her story, we remember her too. We bear witness to the life she lived, the love she gave, and the tragedy that ended it all too soon. Rest in peace, Ellie Mizan Tran. Your voice has been heard. Justice has been served, and your daughter is loved. If this is your first time listening to one of our true crime stories, welcome to Mr. Sleepy Crime, where we explore these cases in a calm and respectful way. I also want to take a moment to appreciate my amazing subscribers who've been rocking with me. Thank you so much for your continued support. If you're still awake and listening, don't forget to drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from and the current time in your corner of the world. Or just say something to let me know you're still here. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories for sleep. Now let's move on to our second story. Story 2. This is a tale of family, of dreams deferred, and of a violence that shattered a quiet morning in Florida. It's a story that reminds us how the people we think we know can harbor darkness we never imagined. This is the story of Richard Langer. In the sprawling aviation community of Leeward Air Ranch, just outside Ocala, Florida, there existed a different kind of neighborhood. Here, homes weren't separated by white picket fences and manicured lawns. Instead, they were connected by a 6,000-foot grass runway that stretched like a ribbon of green through the heart of the community. Residents didn't drive their cars to visit neighbors. They flew. Richard Langer loved it there. At 74 years old, Richard had lived the kind of life that most people only dream about. He was a veteran of the Vietnam War, where he'd flown nearly 130 combat missions for the United States Air Force. Those who knew him said he rarely spoke about those missions, about the fear and adrenaline that must have coursed through him as he navigated hostile skies. That was the past. Richard was humble like that. He didn't need to boast. His service spoke for itself. After the war, Richard found his calling in the civilian world. He became a commercial airline pilot for Southwest Airlines, spending decades in the cockpit, transporting thousands of passengers safely to their destinations. But even in retirement, Richard couldn't stay away from aviation. He participated in something called Angel Flights, a charitable program where volunteer pilots fly doctors, patients, or organs to critical medical appointments. It was Richard's way of giving back, of using his skills to help others in their most desperate moments. His neighbors at Leeward Air Ranch jokingly called him Commander. He was part of a local aviation group, the Humble Squadron, named after him following his death. They flew Chinese warbirds, practiced formation flying, and kept the spirit of aviation history alive. Richard was beloved there, a fixture in the community, always ready with advice or a helping hand. He and his wife Sally had been married for 52 years. Think about that for a moment. 5 decades of partnership, of shared dreams and memories. Together, they'd raised 9 children. 9. Their family had grown to include 18 grandchildren. The home at Leeward Air Ranch was supposed to be their retirement haven, the place where they'd grow old together, where grandchildren would visit, and Richard would take them up in his plane, showing them the world from above. But in September 2022, all of those dreams came crashing down. Christina Ann Adams was the youngest of Richard and Sally's 9 children. At 30 years old in 2022, Christina was at a point in life where most people are finding their footing, building careers, starting families of their own. But Christina's path had been different. She was married to a woman named Brenda, whom she'd met in 2021. They'd married quickly, within a year of meeting. But even in marriage, something wasn't quite right. Christina and Brenda didn't live together. They maintained separate residences. Christina lived in a converted studio apartment on her parents' property at Leeward Air Ranch. It wasn't the main house where Richard and Sally lived. It was described as being just off the main residence, close enough to be connected, far enough to have some independence. It was supposed to be temporary. A place for Christina to get back on her feet, to figure out her next steps. But temporary arrangements have a way of becoming permanent. And in the Langer household, tension was building. We don't know all the details of Christina's relationship with her father. What we do know is that prosecutors would later describe it as strained. There was tension between them. Perhaps it was the natural friction that can occur when adult children live with their parents. Perhaps it was something deeper. Christina would later tell police that she'd suffered abuse in her past and struggled with what she called an undiagnosed mental health disorder. Whether these issues contributed to the tension with her father, we may never fully understand. What we do know is that a few months before September 2022, Richard told Christina that she would need to move out. Another sibling needed the space, he explained. It was time for Christina to find her own place. These conversations likely happened multiple times over those months. The kind of difficult discussions that happen in families when boundaries need to be established, when parents need to push their adult children toward independence. Now, Christina didn't take it well. Friday morning, September 16, 2022, began like any other at the Langer residence. The sun rose over the grass runway at Leeward Air Ranch. Planes sat quietly in hangars, waiting for their owners to take them into the Florida sky. Inside the main house, Richard Langer was at his computer, his back to the door. It was approximately 8 in the morning. What happened next would shatter the peace of that Friday morning and change the Langer family forever. According to Christina's later confession to police, the events unfolded with chilling deliberation. This wasn't a sudden outburst of rage. This was planned. That morning, Richard told Christina that she needed to be out by the next day, not in a few weeks, not gradually, tomorrow. Christina went back to her studio apartment. She put on dark clothing. She pulled on gloves and shoe covers, the kind that leave no trace. She picked up what she would later describe as a taser pen and a large knife, 9 inches long. Then she walked back to the main house. Richard was still at his computer. His back was still to the door. He never saw her coming. Christina said she shocked him first with the taser pen. Imagine the confusion, the sudden pain, the disorientation. Richard turned, and that's when she stabbed him in the arm. Before he could fully process what was happening, his youngest daughter, the child he'd raised and protected, was attacking him with a knife. Sally heard the commotion. Of course she did. When you've been married to someone for 52 years, you know the sounds of their voice, their movements. You know when something is wrong. She rushed into the room to see what was happening. To help her husband, Christina stabbed her in the chest. Then she turned back to Richard, while he was wounded, confused. Trying to understand why his daughter was doing this, Christina stabbed him again, multiple times, in the chest. Over and over. She told police later that she believed both her parents were dead when she left. But Christina didn't call for help. She didn't panic. She didn't break down in tears at what she'd done. Instead, according to investigators, she calmly began to cover her tracks. She took off the bloody clothes and put them in the washing machine. She cleaned the knife with bleach. She changed into fresh clothes. And then, remarkably, she left the house and drove to meet her wife at a local grocery store. Richard Langer was not dead. Despite multiple stab wounds, despite the shock and the blood loss, he was still alive. And he was still a fighter. Remember, this was a man who'd flown combat missions in Vietnam. This was a man who'd faced death before and survived. In those critical moments after Christina left, Richard did what he'd been trained to do in emergencies. He acted. He called 911. The recording of that call was played later during Christina's trial. Jurors heard Richard's voice, weakening but determined. Christina with a knife. He told the dispatcher, "My wife's been attacked too. I'm fading fast." Think about that for a moment. Think about the clarity of mind it takes to make that call when you're dying. To identify your attacker even when that attacker is your own daughter. To think of your wife. To make sure she gets help too. Richard Langer, in his final conscious moments, was trying to save his wife. Emergency services arrived quickly. Marion County Sheriff's deputies rushed to the scene at the residence on Southeast 70th Terrace. What they found was, in their words, a bloodbath. Richard and Sally were both on the floor, suffering from significant injuries, multiple stab wounds, blood everywhere. And Richard, still clinging to consciousness, identified his attacker to the sergeant rendering aid. "My daughter stabbed us," he said. The deputies immediately put out an alert bulletin for Christina Ann Adams. Meanwhile, paramedics worked frantically on both victims. They were transported to a local hospital in critical condition. Both underwent emergency surgery. Richard had been stabbed multiple times in the chest, arm, and back. Sally had been stabbed once, but it was directly in the chest. 2 days later, on September 18th, Richard Langer died from his injuries. He was 74 years old. Sally survived. But she would have to live with the knowledge that her youngest daughter had tried to kill her, that her husband was gone, that their golden years together had been stolen by the person they'd brought into this world. While Richard was making that 911 call, while paramedics were racing to the scene, while her father was fighting for his life, Christina Ann Adams was at the grocery store. Deputies located her vehicle, a gray 2017 Hyundai Santa Fe. Not far from the crime scene, they conducted a traffic stop. Christina was in the driver's seat. Her wife Brenda was in the passenger seat, completely unaware of what had happened. Both women were taken into custody for questioning. Brenda told detectives that she'd been running errands that morning. She'd finished up and met Christina at the grocery store, just as they'd planned. She said Christina seemed perfectly normal. Nothing was out of the ordinary. Christina hadn't mentioned any conflict, any argument, anything wrong at all. It was just another Friday morning, another shopping trip. But when detectives questioned Christina, her story didn't match up with her wife's accounts. At first she denied involvement. She told them she didn't know anything about the stabbing. But as the interview continued, as detectives presented the evidence, Christina's story began to change. Finally, she admitted it. Yes, she'd attacked her parents. She'd stabbed them both. She'd believed they were both dead. She hadn't tried to get medical attention for them. She hadn't called 911. She'd simply assumed they would die and began her cleanup operation. Christina told detectives she'd retrieved a large knife, attacked both victims, changed her clothing, attempted to destroy evidence, and then went shopping at the local grocery store. She said she'd done her laundry, met a friend, gone about her day as if nothing had happened, as if she hadn't just tried to murder both of her parents. When asked why, Christina said she was angry about being told to move out. That was it. That was the reason. Not abuse happening in the moment. Not self-defense. Just anger over being asked to leave. She mentioned her undiagnosed mental health condition, her past trauma. These things may have been real. They may have contributed to her state of mind. But they didn't explain the planning, the gloves and shoe covers, the deliberate cover-up. Those actions spoke to something else. to premeditation, to awareness of right and wrong, to consciousness of guilt. Christina was arrested and taken to Marion County Jail. She was charged with 2 counts of attempted first-degree murder and destroying evidence. After Richard died 2 days later, the charges were upgraded. First-degree murder. Attempted first-degree murder. She was held without bail, awaiting trial. It took more than 2 years for the case to go to trial. Christina Ann Adams sat in jail throughout that time, from September 2022 until April 2025. There was no plea deal offered. The state was moving forward with first-degree murder charges, seeking life in prison. On April 15th and 16th, 2025, the trial began. Jury selection took place on Monday. 13 people were chosen, 12 jurors and 1 alternate. The trial lasted just 2 days. Sometimes in true crime cases, trials drag on for weeks or months. Witnesses are called and recalled. Evidence is debated endlessly. But this case was different. The evidence was, as prosecutors described it, irrefutable. Assistant state attorneys, Toby Hunt and Amy Burnt, presented the state's case methodically. They played the 911 recording. Imagine being a juror and hearing Richard Langer's voice, hearing him identify his daughter as his attacker, hearing him say, "I'm fading fast." That recording alone must have been devastating. They showed crime scene photographs, the blood, the aftermath of violence in a home that was supposed to be a haven. They presented evidence of the cleanup, the attempt to destroy evidence, the shopping trip that followed. Christina's defense attorney, Junior Barrett from the Office of Criminal Conflict and Civil Regional Counsel, had an impossible task. What do you say when your client has confessed? When the victim identified her before he died? When the physical evidence is overwhelming? During the trial, family members testified. Not Christina's siblings, but her parents' friends and neighbors. One neighbor took the stand and described Richard as a Vietnam veteran who'd flown nearly 130 combat missions. He called Richard humble, a true patriot. He said Richard's survival instincts and grit were what had kept him alive long enough to make that 911 call, long enough to save his wife. Christina's siblings attended the trial, but they were there for their father and their mother, not for Christina. The state painted a picture of Christina as calculated, cold, emotionless. They noted that when she was arrested, she showed no emotion whatsoever, while her wife Brenda became hysterical upon learning what had happened. Christina remained stone-faced. The jury was allowed to ask questions throughout the trial. This isn't common in all jurisdictions, but it happened here. Jurors could write down questions, hand them to the judge, and after discussion with the attorneys, those questions would be asked of witnesses. We don't know what questions the jurors asked, but we can imagine they were trying to understand, how does a daughter do this to her parents? What kind of person commits such violence over being asked to move out? After closing arguments, the jury deliberated for 3 hours. In a trial that lasted 2 days, 3 hours of deliberation is actually quite substantial. It suggests the jurors took their responsibility seriously, that they discussed the evidence, perhaps debated the mental health issues Christina had mentioned. But in the end, the evidence was clear. The verdict: guilty on both counts. First-degree premeditated murder. Attempted first-degree murder with a deadly weapon. The sentencing hearing took place on April 16th, 2025. It happened to fall on what would have been Richard Langer's 77th birthday. The cruelty of that timing was not lost on anyone in the courtroom. Before Judge Timothy McCourt imposed sentence, he allowed victims' family members to speak. 2 of Richard's sons spoke. A daughter spoke. A close family friend spoke. They talked about their father, about what he'd meant to them, about the hole his death had left in their lives. They spoke about how their grandchildren would grow up without their grandfather, without the chance to fly with him, to learn from him, to hear his stories. They talked about their mother, Sally, who survived the attack but whose life would never be the same. They said she was being loved and cherished by everyone, as their father would have wanted, but she had to live with the trauma, the physical scars, and the emotional devastation of being attacked by her own daughter. The siblings described their parents' plans for the future. Richard and Sally were supposed to grow old together. They were going to travel to spend time with their grandchildren, to fly. Richard loved flying. It was his passion, his calling. All of that was stolen in a moment of violence that morning in September. Christina was asked if she wanted to say anything. She had the opportunity to speak, to apologize, to explain, to show remorse. She said no. She sat there stone-faced, silent. Judge Timothy McCourt sentenced Christina Ann Adams to 2 consecutive life sentences. Not concurrent, which would have meant she'd serve them at the same time. Consecutive, one after the other. She would serve life in prison for the murder of Richard Langer. Then she would serve another life sentence for the attempted murder of Sally Langer. In practical terms, it meant Christina would never leave prison. She would die behind bars. Chief Assistant State Attorney Walter Forgy issued a statement after the sentencing. Our fundamental duty is to seek justice, and in pursuing this goal, we strive to provide closure for the victims and their families, while ensuring accountability for those responsible. Today, as difficult as it has been for the victims and their families, I believe we've gotten just that. Richard Langer left behind a legacy. He was survived by his wife, 9 children, but one of them would spend the rest of her life in prison for killing him, and 18 grandchildren. His obituary described him as a veteran, a pilot, an instructor, a mentor, a friend, and an all-around amazing human being. At Leeward Air Ranch, the community that Richard loved, the aviation enthusiasts named their squadron after him. The humble squadron, they called him Commander, a title of respect and affection. They still fly their Chinese warbirds, still practice their formations, still gather for fly-ins, and they remember Richard. Sally Langer survived. But at what cost? She lost her husband of 52 years. She bears physical scars from being stabbed, and she must live with the knowledge that her youngest daughter tried to kill her, did kill her husband, and showed no remorse for any of it. The other 8 Langer children must navigate an impossible grief. They lost their father to violence. They nearly lost their mother, and the person responsible is their sister. How do you process that? How do you mourn your father while knowing your sister murdered him? How do you visit your mother while she recovers from being attacked by your sibling? Christina Ann Adams is 33 years old now. She'll spend the rest of her life in a Florida State Correctional Facility. No more sunshine. No more freedom. No more possibility of redemption or rebuilding. Just decades of concrete and bars and the knowledge of what she's done. What possesses someone to commit such an act? That's the question we always ask in cases like this. Was it mental illness? Christina mentioned an undiagnosed condition, but mental illness doesn't automatically lead to violence. Most people struggling with mental health issues never harm anyone, and the planning involved here, the gloves and shoe covers, the cleanup, the shopping trip, all suggest someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Was it past trauma? Christina said she'd been abused. If true, that's terrible and deserving of compassion. But it doesn't justify violence. It doesn't excuse murder. Many people survive abuse and never become abusers themselves. Perhaps it was simply entitlement. The inability to accept a boundary, the rage at being told no, at being asked to take responsibility for her own life. Christina was 30 years old, married, capable of living independently, but she'd remained in her parents' home, in that converted studio, dependent on them. And when they asked her to leave, when they set a boundary, she responded with lethal violence. We may never fully understand Christina's motivations. She's never explained them beyond saying she was angry about being told to move out. She offered no apology, no explanation at her sentencing. She remains, by all accounts, emotionally detached from the horror of what she's done. As you drift off to sleep tonight, think about Richard Langer. Not about how he died, but about how he lived. Think about the young man who enlisted in the Air Force, who flew combat missions in Vietnam, who came home and built a life. Think about the pilot who spent decades safely transporting passengers, who volunteered his time and skills to help sick people get to medical appointments. Think about the husband who loved his wife for 52 years, the father who raised 9 children, the grandfather who would have loved to take his grandchildren flying. Think about that morning in September when Richard's life was stolen from him. But think too about his courage in those final moments. Making that 911 call, identifying his attacker, trying to save his wife. Richard Langer died as he lived, as a man who faced danger head-on and tried to protect the people he loved. The case of Christina Ann Adams is closed. Justice, such as it is, has been served. But for the Langer family, the pain continues. They're learning to live with a loss that should never have happened, with a betrayal that cuts deeper than any knife wound. In Ocala, Florida, at Leeward Air Ranch, planes still take off and land on that long grass runway. The humble squadron still flies. And somewhere in that community, Sally Langer lives on, surrounded by the memories of her life with Richard, by the love of her other children, by the support of neighbors and friends. She survived. And in her survival, Richard's sacrifice, his final act of courage in making that call, was not in vain. Please, if you're still awake, drop a candle. I want to see who's still with me. Also, don't forget to tell me where you're listening from, the time in your corner of the world, and maybe share one thing you've learned from tonight's stories. Meanwhile, let's move on to our third story. Story 3. This is the story of Annie Gabrielle Moss, a 10-year-old girl from Lawrenceville, Georgia, whose bright smile and gentle spirit were extinguished far too soon. It's a story about systemic failures, missed opportunities, and the unthinkable cruelty that can exist behind closed doors. But more than anything, it's about remembering a child who deserved so much better than the hand life dealt her. April 23rd, 2003. That was the day Imani Gabrielle Moss entered the world in Georgia. From her very first breath, the odds seemed stacked against this little girl. Her biological mother struggled with addiction, a battle so consuming that shortly after Imani's birth, she made the painful decision to surrender her parental rights. Imani was one of 5 children her mother would ultimately give up, each one caught in the wake of addiction's devastating current. Custody of Imani went to her father, Iman Moss. By all early accounts, Iman tried to be present in his daughter's life. He took her to Freedom Christian Church regularly, where the congregation came to know the little girl with the infectious smile. Those who knew young Imani in those early years remember her as precious, a word that would come up again and again when people spoke about her. She had that quality some children possess, a light that made people smile when she entered a room. But darkness already lurked at the edges of Imani's young life. In 2004, when Imani was barely more than a year old, her father was charged with battery and second-degree child cruelty. The incident involved him beating Imani's biological mother in front of the child. It was an early warning sign, a crack in the foundation that would only widen with time. Despite this conviction, Iman maintained custody of his daughter. He worked to support them both, and to outside observers, they seemed to be managing. Imani attended church, and as she grew, she discovered interests that made her happy. She loved ballet, the grace and beauty of it. She took guitar lessons, her small fingers learning to coax music from the strings. These were the normal, beautiful things of childhood that every child deserves. It was at Freedom Christian Church that Iman met Tiffany Nicole Moss. Born on July 20th, 1983, Tiffany worked as a preschool teacher. She had pursued education that would allow her to work with both children and the elderly, dual certifications that suggested someone who cared about vulnerable populations. When she and Iman began their relationship, it might have seemed like a blessing, another caring adult in Imani's life. The relationship progressed, and eventually Iman and Tiffany married. Imani, still quite young, found herself with a stepmother. At first, as these things often go, there might have been an adjustment period, a new family dynamic to navigate. Tiffany would later have 2 children of her own with Iman, giving Imani younger half-siblings. But beneath the surface of this blended family, something dark was taking root. March 2010, Imani was 6 years old, in first grade at her elementary school. On this particular day, she had received a bad report card. For most children, this might mean disappointment, perhaps being grounded or losing privileges. For Imani, it meant something much worse. She needed to see the school nurse that day, and when she did, the words that came from the 6-year-old's mouth were chilling. She told the nurse she was afraid to go home with her bad report card. Afraid because she worried her parents would hurt her. She specifically mentioned her stepmother, Tiffany, saying she had been spanked with a curtain rod. The nurse, trained to recognize signs of abuse, examined Imani more closely. What she found was horrifying. Imani's small body was covered in injuries. Multiple scabs, bruises, and welts marked her arms. back, chest, legs, and shoulders. This wasn't the result of one incident. These were layers of abuse, old injuries healing while new ones formed. The authorities were immediately contacted. Imani was taken to the police headquarters, away from her home and the people who had hurt her. Tiffany Moss was arrested and charged with first-degree child cruelty. During questioning, Tiffany admitted to hitting Imani. Her explanation: she had struck the child 3 times for failing to do her homework. Just 3 times, she said, as if minimizing the number could somehow justify the injuries that covered a 6-year-old's body. The evidence suggested the abuse had been far more extensive than 3 strikes. The case proceeded through the legal system, and here's where one of the most critical failures occurred. Tiffany Moss pleaded guilty to the child cruelty charge. The sentence: 5 years of probation under Georgia's first offender program. It was a plea deal signed by the Georgia Division of Family and Children's Services, the very agency tasked with protecting children like Imani. Part of this arrangement required both Tiffany and Emin to complete parenting classes. Once they did, the case against them was dismissed by DFCS. The system had given them a second chance, an opportunity to do better. More importantly, it had given Imani back to them. Immediately after the March 2010 incident, Imani was removed from her father and stepmother's home. She went to live with her paternal grandmother, Robin Moss. For 6 months, Imani lived with her grandmother, and during this time something remarkable happened. Her school performance improved. Teachers noticed a change in her demeanor. The fear seemed to ease from her young shoulders. Robin Moss could see what was happening. She knew, with the certainty that grandmothers sometimes possess, that Imani was being abused by Tiffany. She fought to keep custody of her granddaughter, to be the safe harbor Imani so desperately needed. But in the fall of 2010, despite Robin's objections and pleas, DFCS returned Imani to her father's care. Prosecutors would later argue at trial that this March 2010 abuse incident was not an isolated event, but rather the launch of an escalating cycle, each act of cruelty built upon the last, a terrible momentum that would eventually prove unstoppable. The abuse had another consequence beyond Imani's physical and emotional trauma. Tiffany Moss had pleaded guilty to child cruelty, and as a result, she was no longer permitted to work as a preschool teacher. She lost her career, her source of income and identity, and in Tiffany's mind, this was Imani's fault. The child had told someone about the abuse. The child had caused this. Resentment festered and grew, poisoning whatever relationship might have existed between stepmother and stepdaughter. From 2011 through the summer of 2013, the Moss family became increasingly mobile. They moved frequently, sometimes living with extended family members, sometimes in their own apartments. The constant relocations created a kind of instability that made it harder for anyone outside the family to maintain consistent contact with Imani.
The man worked long hours. He would later testify that he often worked 2 jobs trying to support his growing family.
Tiffany had given birth to their 2 children, and the financial pressures mounted. Emin was rarely home, and when he was there, he was exhausted. He later told the court that he didn't see his daughter often during this period. On weekends when he was in charge of the children, he noticed that Imani would eat a lot, as if making up for lost time. In July 2012, something happened that should have been another massive red flag. Imani, then 9 years old, tried to run away from home. Not once, but twice in the same month. Think about that for a moment. A 9-year-old child so desperate to escape her home that she attempted to flee. Not once, but twice. This was a child screaming for help in the only way she knew how. But the system, once again, failed to hear her. In May 2013, the Moss family visited Emin's sister Sharon's house for Mother's Day. It was one of the increasingly rare occasions when extended family got to see Imani. What they saw disturbed them deeply. Imani's hair had been cut short, in a way that seemed less like a haircut and more like a punishment. When Robin confronted Tiffany about it, the response was chilling. Tiffany said, and these words were remembered and repeated later: "If you act ugly, you should look ugly." Sharonese also noticed that Imani's demeanor had changed. The bright, precious child they remembered had become more timid, more withdrawn. The light in her was dimming. After the 2012 to 2013 school year ended, Amin and Tiffany made an announcement that would seal Imani's fate. They were going to pull her out of public school and homeschool her instead. Sharonese objected immediately. She understood what this meant. If Yanni wasn't going to school, there would be no teachers to notice bruises, no school nurse she could confide in, no mandated reporters who might intervene. She called the Georgia Division of Family and Children's Services, begging them to step in to prevent this from happening. The FCS declined to intervene. Prosecutors would later describe the decision to homeschool Imani with stark clarity. It was code for isolate and hide. Once Imani was pulled from school, she would have no teacher to save her, no protector to notice what was happening behind the closed doors of the Moss home. And that's exactly what happened. Imani pretty much disappeared from public view after that. She was kept in her bedroom, which prosecutors would describe as her own personal prison. The walls that should have protected her became the walls that imprisoned her. The abuse that had started with beatings evolved into something even more sinister. Tiffany Moss began to starve Yemi. Systematically, deliberately, day after day after day. Here's what made it even more horrific. During this same period, Tiffany was taking care of her own two biological children. She fed them. She cared for them. She texted Emin photos of elaborate dishes she prepared for the family while he was at work. The apartment had food in it. The refrigerator wasn't empty. The other children weren't going hungry. Only Amani was being denied sustenance. Amani was confined to her bedroom, living in filth. She became too weak to leave the bed, lying in her own waste because she couldn't move. And through it all, the starvation continued. Medical experts would later explain the stages of starvation to the jury, painting a picture so horrific that grown adults wept. The first phase involves loss of well-being, hunger pains, and food cravings. Can you imagine a 10-year-old girl lying in bed, her stomach cramping with hunger, knowing there's food in the house but she's not allowed to have any? The second stage brings apathy and fatigue, weight loss, changes in skin pigmentation, what medical experts call a feral look, and hypothermia. Imani's small body began to consume itself, burning through what little fat she had, then moving on to muscle tissue. The third stage is characterized by extreme lethargy, cognitive decline, nutritional edema, immune system suppression, infections, diarrhea, and finally death. This process takes weeks. Weeks of suffering. Weeks where, according to prosecutors, Tiffany Moss woke up every single morning and made a conscious choice. Every day for approximately 60 days, she decided, I'm going to kill that baby today. October 28th, 2013. It was late in the month, autumn in Georgia. Inside the Moss apartment in Lawrenceville near the Coventry Point Apartments, Imani Gabrielle Moss died. She was 10 years old, a few days before her death. A man testified that he came home from work and found Imani in the bathtub. She appeared to be having some kind of seizure. Her eyes were rolling, moving side to side and up and down. It was hard to see life in them, he said. This was her body beginning to shut down, the final stages of her sin taking hold. On the 28th, Amen was at work when his phone rang. It was Tiffany. The words she spoke were simple and devastating. Imani was dead. When Amen got home, he found his daughter lying on a blanket on the floor of her bedroom. He described it later to the jury in words that seemed almost poetic in their simplicity. She was dead. She was cold. Her essence wasn't there. She was gone. The little girl who loved ballet and guitar, who had a smile that people remembered years later, who was described by her fourth-grade teacher as precious and a blessing, was gone. Her body weighed 32 pounds. 32 pounds. That's the average weight of a toddler, a 3-year-old. Imani was 10. At this moment, Imama and Tiffany had a choice. They could call for help. They could face the consequences of what had happened. They could at least give Imani the dignity of a proper goodbye. Instead, Tiffany said something that Ammon would repeat in court years later. We can't call 911. We've got to hide the body. What happened next is almost too horrible to comprehend. Imani's body was moved to the computer room in the apartment. For a day or two, she lay there while life in the Moss household continued around her. The younger children, Imani's half-siblings, went about their days. Tiffany and Imani discussed what to do, how to conceal what had happened, how to make it seem like Imani had simply run away. They made a plan. They got a galvanized steel trash can. They obtained duct tape and wrapped Imani's tiny body preparing it for disposal like she was garbage. Then they placed her in the trash can. A man loaded the trash can containing his daughter's body into the back of his Chevrolet Trailblazer. The next morning he drove Tiffany and the two younger children home. The trash can still in the back of the vehicle. Then he went to work. His first job of the day, he performed his duties, interacted with coworkers, went through the motions of normalcy while his daughter's body was in his truck. During testimony, describing this moment, Emmett appeared shocked, as if he were hearing his own actions for the first time and couldn't quite believe them. The jury was in tears. Many of them couldn't hold back their emotion, and Tiffany Moss sat at the defense table, stoic, almost bored looking. After his first shift, a man called a friend. He asked to meet him, said he needed to talk. They met at a QT gas station, a local chain. In the parking lot, a man told his friend what had happened. He told him what was in the Trailblazer. His friend's reaction was immediate. He jumped out of the vehicle and told the man in no uncertain terms, "You need to call the police. No matter what Tiffany says, you need to call the police right now." Something in those words must have gotten through. He man drove home and told Tiffany he was going to call 911. Immediately, Tiffany gathered the two younger children and left, going to her mother's house. When police arrived at the apartment on November 2nd, 2013, Ammon told them a story. He claimed that Amani had drunk some chemicals and died. He said he had panicked, put her body in the trash can outside the apartment, and tried to cremate it. The officers found Amani's body in the trash can at the curb. It showed signs of burning, an attempt to destroy evidence. But the moment they saw the body, they knew Amani's story was a lie. This wasn't a case of accidental poisoning. Amani's body told a story of long-term abuse and starvation. She was extremely emaciated, with no muscle tone left in her arms or legs. Her face was drawn. She was skin and bones. Literally. Ammon was arrested immediately. Tiffany, after dropping the children at her mother's house, eventually turned herself in. They were both charged with murder, concealing a body, and child cruelty. They were held without bond in the Gwinnett County Jail. In the aftermath of Amani's death, the investigation revealed a pattern of failures that should haunt everyone involved in child welfare. Just 4 months before Amani died, DFCS received an anonymous call. The caller reported that Amani was being neglected by her father and stepmother. Specifically, the caller mentioned that the child was too thin. This was a direct warning about the starvation that would ultimately kill her. According to a lawsuit later filed by Robin Moss, the agency did not follow up on this call. The case was screened out, with notes indicating no address and no current maltreatment. There was no indication that the caseworker made any effort to actually locate Imani. Back in 2012, before the homeschooling began, Imani's school had reported emotional and psychological neglect to DFCS. This was after Tiffany allegedly hit Imani with a belt for eating too slowly. Think about that, hitting a child for eating too slowly, a cruel irony given what would come later. Robin Moss had never stopped fighting for her granddaughter. She had suspected abuse, had reported concerns, had begged for custody. She told investigators after Imani's death, "I never stopped fighting for her. I see her hurt, and what will not go away is the part where they throw her away." The DFCS case file on Imani Moss was extensive, spanning nearly all of her troubled life. The redactions couldn't hide the pattern of alleged abuse by her father and stepmother. The file documented the torture Imani endured, described by her own father to police: scolding with boiling water, isolation like a prisoner, and the starvation that yoled her. Following Imani's murder, there were consequences for DFCS. Though they came far too late for Imani, an intake case manager, a social services administrator, and a program assistant were all terminated. Others were reportedly disciplined. The department enacted reforms, including deeper investigations into allegations of abuse and changes to how maltreatment reports were assembled. These systemic changes were necessary. They might save future children, but they couldn't bring back the little girl with the infectious smile who loved ballet and guitar. In August 2015, Emmett Moss made a deal with prosecutors. He pleaded guilty to felony murder and concealing a death. In exchange for his testimony against Tiffany, the state agreed not to seek the death penalty against him. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Emmett is currently incarcerated at the Smith State Prison in Glenville, Georgia. He will die behind bars, which some might call justice, though it seems a small price for allowing his daughter to be tortured to death. Tiffany Moss was offered the same plea deal: life in prison without parole in exchange for a guilty plea. She rejected it. The case went to trial. The trial began on April 15th, 2019, presided over by Judge George Hutchinson. And here's where the case took a bizarre turn that captured national attention. Tiffany Moss decided to represent herself in a capital murder case where she faced the death penalty. State Capitol defenders Brad Gardner and Emily Gilbert had been assigned to her case, experienced attorneys who knew how to handle death penalty defenses. But more than a year before the trial, Moss made her decision. She was putting her fate in God's hands, she said. Judge Hutchinson allowed her to act as her own attorney, but appointed Gardner and Gilbert as standby counsel. They sat in the courtroom gallery behind Moss, ready to assist if called upon, but unable to advocate for her directly. In prior court motions, the defenders had disclosed that Moss had suffered brain damage. Newer psychological testing showed damage to the pyramidal and prefrontal regions of her brain. The details were presented to Judge Hutchinson in a closed hearing, but Moss was deemed competent to represent herself, and the trial proceeded. What followed was one of the most unusual capital murder trials in Georgia history. Tiffany Moss mounted absolutely no defense. She didn't prepare for trial. She never once addressed the jury. She presented no evidence in her favor, and most remarkably, she asked no questions of any of the prosecution's witnesses. The prosecutors, District Attorney Danny Porter and Chief Assistant District Attorney Lisa Jones, presented testimony from 18 witnesses. They painted a devastating portrait of a woman who systematically tortured and murdered her stepdaughter. Lisa Neal, Imani's fourth-grade teacher from Bethesda Elementary School, testified that Imani was precious, and it was a blessing to have her in my classroom. Other teachers and school personnel described a child who wanted to make people happy, who was sweet and kind. Family members testified about the changes they saw in Imani: the increasing isolation, the fear in her eyes. Robin Moss, Imani's grandmother, sat in the courtroom as Iman described how he and Tiffany disposed of Imani's body. One can only imagine her pain, sitting there knowing she had tried to save her granddaughter and had been denied. Crime scene investigators described finding Imane's body. They showed the jury the galvanized steel trash can, the duct tape, the lighter used in the attempt to burn her body. They displayed photographs of the room where Imani had starved to death. Medical examiner Dr. Michelle Stoffmerg provided expert testimony about Imani's death. She described the stages of starvation in clinical terms that somehow made the horror even more real. The autopsy photos showed Imani's emaciated body, and jurors silently cried as they viewed them. Some covered their faces. Others brought their hands to their mouths. One juror put his head in his hands. Stoffenberg testified that Imani was more or less skin and bones when she died. The cause of death was starvation, no doubt about it. And then there was Emin's testimony. He took the stand wearing a green prison jumpsuit, his hands and feet shackled with chains that clanged as he walked across the courtroom. He glanced at Tiffany as he entered. She sat alone at the defense table, the woman he was married to, the woman he was about to testify against. For 90 minutes, Emin gave harrowing testimony about Imani's final days. He described finding her having seizures in the bathtub, the phone call at work telling him she was dead, coming home to find her body cold, her essence gone, the decision not to call 911, wrapping her body in duct tape, putting her in the trash can, driving to work with her body in the truck. Throughout all of this testimony, Tiffany Moss occasionally looked up at her husband. Her expression remained neutral, unreadable. When Judge Hutchinson asked if she had questions for Amin, she said she had no questions, just as she had for every other witness. On the fourth day of trial, April 29th, 2019, the jury began deliberations. They deliberated for just under 3 hours before reaching a verdict. Guilty on all 6 charges. 1 count of malice murder, 2 counts of felony murder, 2 counts of first-degree cruelty to children, 1 count of concealing the death of another. It was, as one observer noted, one of the least surprising verdicts in Georgia history. How could it be otherwise when the defendant mounted no defense? But the trial wasn't over. Now came the sentencing phase. Under Georgia law in capital murder cases, the jury must decide between 2 sentences: life in prison without parole, or death. The same jury that convicted Tiffany Moss now had to determine if she should die for her crimes. On April 30th, Danny Porter addressed the jury, asking them to sentence Moss to death. He recounted the medical examiner's testimony about the stages of starvation. He reminded them that this process took weeks. Who in the world conceives of or executes a plan to starve a 10-year-old to death? He asked the jury, there are some crimes that are so horrible, so heinous. The only balance you can pay is with your life. Justice demands the proper payment. Lisa Jones described Tiffany's attitude toward Imani in stark terms. Imani was nothing to Moss. She was a nuisance. She was ugly. She was nothing. She was a pain. She was disposable. She was trash. Porter emphasized that while Amen was also guilty, he was the follower in this relationship. Do you think that fool Amen could have really come up with this plan? Do you really think he was the brains of the outfit? Porter argued that Tiffany was the mastermind, that Amen had been seduced and enamored and under the influence of this defendant to the point where he turned his eyes away from his own child. On Monday evening, the jury sent a note to Judge Hutchinson. They were at an impasse and wanted to go home and sleep on it. The judge granted the request. On Tuesday, May 1st, 2019, they returned to deliberations. After 2.5 hours, they reached a decision. The jury filed back into the courtroom. Tiffany Moss sat at the defense table, expressionless as she had been throughout the trial. The verdict was read. Death. Death by lethal injection. Moss showed no emotion as the unanimous decision was read aloud. She became Georgia's only woman on death row. If the sentence is carried out, she would be only the third woman executed in Georgia's history. There's no joy when a jury imposes a death sentence. District Attorney Danny Porter said after court adjourned. But this was one of the worst cases I've ever seen. The first time you look at it, it made you sick. The last time you look at it, it makes you sick. Amen and Tiffany Moss, remarkably, remain married even now, but they lost custody of their 2 younger children immediately after Imani's murder. The children were sent to live with foster parents. Both grandmothers, Robin Moss and Tiffany's mother, Pearlie, attempted to gain custody, as did the Moss couple themselves. In 2019, Porter told local news that the children had been adopted by their foster parents. The couple's son, who was 3 years old when Imani was murdered, reportedly had some memories of what happened. But according to Porter, at the time of the interview in April 2019, the children were doing great. The hope is that they might never know the full extent of what occurred in that apartment. Shortly after her death sentence, the Georgia Capitol Defender Office filed a motion for a new trial on Moss's behalf. They argued, among other things, that Moss was not competent to act as her own attorney. They pointed to the neuropsychological testing data showing brain damage to the premotor and prefrontal regions. A status hearing was held on August 23, 2019. The appeals process in capital cases is lengthy and complex. Under Georgia law, there's an automatic appeal to the state Supreme Court in all death penalty cases, even if the condemned person doesn't want representation. In January 2024, Gwinnett County Superior Court Judge Karen Byers rejected Moss's motion for a new trial. In her ruling, she stated that Moss intelligently, voluntarily, and knowingly invoked her right to self-representation. As of now, Tiffany Moss remains on death row at Arendelle State Prison. She is still Georgia's only female death row inmate. The appeals process continues. Whether the death sentence will ultimately be carried out remains to be seen. Amen Moss remains in Smith State Prison, serving his life sentence without parole. And Imani would have turned 22 years old in April of 2025 if she had lived. She might have finished college, might have been pursuing a career, might have been in love, might have been creating art or music, or building a life filled with all the possibilities that were stolen from her. Instead, she's remembered through court documents and news articles, through the testimony of teachers who cherished her, and a grandmother who fought for her, through the reforms her death prompted in Georgia's child welfare system. There's a particular cruelty in how Imani died. She was disposed of like trash, burned and hidden away, as if she had never mattered at all. But she did matter. She mattered to her grandmother, Robin. She mattered to her teachers. She mattered to the community members who were horrified by her death. She mattered to the prosecutors who fought for justice on her behalf. And she should have mattered most of all to the people who were supposed to protect her. The case of Animas asks uncomfortable questions about the systems we've built to protect vulnerable children. How many warning signs do there need to be before action is taken? How many times does a child have to ask for help before someone truly intervenes? Imani tried. She told a school nurse she was afraid. She showed up with bruises. She tried to run away twice. Her teachers noticed changes. Her grandmother fought for custody. An anonymous caller reported concerns about her being too thin. The signs were there, painted in neon lights. Impossible to miss. And yet the system missed them, or saw them and failed to act decisively enough. Imani was returned again and again to the home where she was being abused, until finally she couldn't be returned anymore because she was gone. The reforms that followed Imani's death are important. Deeper investigations into abuse allegations. Better assembly of maltreatment reports. These changes might save lives. We have to hope they will. But they couldn't save Imani Gabrielle Moss, the 10-year-old girl who loved ballet and guitar, who was described as precious by everyone who knew her, who deserved to grow up and experience all the beautiful things life had to offer. Instead, she died alone, starved in a room that became her prison, failed by nearly every adult who should have protected her. Rest in peace, Imani. You deserved so much better. You mattered. You are remembered. So if you're still awake, I'd like to know which of tonight's stories gave you chills the most. Was it the first story, the second, or the third? Meanwhile, let's move on to our fourth story. Story 4. In the quiet suburbs of Reynoldsburg, Ohio, just outside Columbus, February 19, 2024, began like any other winter Monday. The Tussing Place Apartments, a modest complex on Drew Heights Place, housed families going about their ordinary lives. Children had recently returned from school. Workers were coming home. But inside one particular apartment, something had been building for a very long time. Something that, according to those who loved him most, had been waiting to break for years. This is the story of Jihad Hughes, a 21-year-old man who, by all accounts, shouldn't have died that day. A man whose death would leave his family shattered in ways that seem almost impossible to comprehend. Because Jihad wasn't killed by a stranger. He wasn't killed in a random act of violence on the streets. He was killed by the person who brought him into this world, his mother. But to understand what happened on that February afternoon, we need to understand who Jihad was. We need to understand the life he lived, and perhaps most importantly, the darkness that had been growing in the home, where he should have been safe. Jihad Hughes was, by every measure, a young man trying to build a life. Born to J.D. Hughes and LaQuandra Williams, he grew up with siblings in central Ohio. Those who knew him described him with consistent words: quiet, respectable, nice. He was the kind of person who didn't demand attention, who spoke only when he had something meaningful to say. In 2021, Jihad graduated from Groveport Madison High School. It wasn't the end of his journey, but a beginning. The following year, in 2022, he made a decision that spoke to his character. He enlisted in the United States Army. It was a path that suggested purpose, structure, a young man looking toward his future with determination. But Jihad's life wasn't defined solely by institutions or career paths. At his core, faith meant everything to him. He was a devoted member of God's Way Power of Love ministry, under the guidance of Pastor Nathaniel Johnson Sr. Those who worshipped alongside him noticed how he embraced the Word of God, how gospel music seemed to speak to something deep within him. It was more than routine. It was genuine. Family, too, was central to Jihad's world. He especially cherished his nephew, Malachi. In many ways, Jihad had become a father figure to the boy. The time they spent together wasn't just about being an uncle. It was about presence, about showing up, about being the kind of man a child could look up to. These weren't grand gestures. They were the quiet, steady acts of love that defined character. He was, as one family member would later describe him, a man of few words. But when Jihad spoke, people listened. There was weight to his presence, even in his silence. And as February 2024 arrived, he was still building that life, still moving forward, still being the person those around him had come to depend on. He had no way of knowing that the apartment he shared with his mother and siblings would soon become the site of his death. What happened inside that apartment on Drew Heights Place didn't begin on February 19th. It had been building for years. This is perhaps the most haunting aspect of Jihad's story. The sense that those who loved him had seen this coming, had feared it, but had been powerless to stop it. LaQuandra Williams was 44 years old in February 2024. She was a mother of multiple children. She worked as a caregiver. From the outside, she was living an ordinary life in an ordinary suburb. But according to those closest to the family, something had been deeply wrong for a very long time. After Jihad's death, his father, J.D. Hughes, would stand in a courtroom and speak words that carry immense weight. He would describe what happened to his son not as a sudden tragedy, but as the inevitable result of something that had been festering in the darkness. What happened to my son on February 19th, 2024, when he was pronounced dead, the victim of a gunshot wound that entered his back at the hands of his mother, was no accident. J.D. would tell the court. Jihad's murder was the result of years of systemic abuse that spiraled out of control. Years of systemic abuse. Think about those words. Not a momentary lapse. Not a single argument that went too far. Years. Systemic abuse. One of Jihad's sisters would later post on social media, her words raw with grief and confusion. "My heart is so crushed," she wrote. "I never would have imagined this happening. I lost my brother and my mom." Then she added something that suggests the family had been aware of their mother's struggles. "If you're dealing with a mental illness, please go and get help." She would go on to write about her brother's death in terms that are almost unbearable to consider. "My brother didn't deserve to die behind the hands of our mother. Not being in her right state of mind," she wrote. "But sometimes the devil, when you let him in, he takes over your mind, then body. And then this. He's a hero. He saved my sisters to no longer having to deal with this trauma. Finally, no more pain." These aren't the words of someone shocked by an isolated incident. These are the words of someone who had been living in fear. Someone who understood that danger lived inside their home. Jihad's defense attorney Peter Scranton would later describe the case as different from any he'd encountered. "I cannot even begin to fathom what she's thinking and how she's feeling," he said of LaQuandra Williams. "Here you have somebody who lost her son and he has siblings, so she feels bad for her children. She's upset. But what had been happening in that apartment? What had Jihad and his siblings been enduring? The full details remain locked within the family's private pain. What we know is that by February 2024, whatever had been building was about to reach its terrible conclusion. It was approximately 1:45 in the afternoon when the first call came into Columbus Police Dispatch. Shots fired. The Tussing Place Apartments, near Tussing Elementary School. Officers were dispatched immediately, but the horror had begun inside the apartment several minutes earlier. What started as an argument, the nature of which has never been publicly disclosed, had escalated with terrifying speed. According to witnesses who were present, LaQuandra Williams grabbed a knife. Not to threaten, not to make a point, to use. She attempted to stab her son. Multiple witnesses would later tell police that they saw this happen, that they tried to intervene, tried to get the knife away from Williams. But it was Jihad himself who managed to disarm his mother, taking the weapon from her hands. Think about that moment. Your mother tries to stab you. You manage to take the knife away. The immediate danger seems to have passed. What would you do? Where would your mind go? For Jihad, the answer seems clear. He needed to leave. This was no longer safe. Whatever had been wrong for years had finally broken completely. But Williams wasn't done. According to the witnesses, after being disarmed, she said something chilling. 4 words that would echo through court documents, news reports. "I'm going to show you something." She walked outside to her vehicle. Everyone in that apartment knew what she kept in her car. A handgun. Witnesses and Jihad understood immediately what was happening. They acted quickly, locking the doors behind Williams, keeping her outside. They had created a barrier, however temporary. But Jihad had made a decision. He wasn't going to stay. He couldn't stay. He began packing his bags, his belongings, the essentials of his life. He was 21 years old, preparing to walk out of his mother's home, perhaps understanding on some level that he could never come back. The witnesses watched him pack. They must have felt the tension, the fear of what would happen when he stepped outside. Did they try to convince him to stay, to wait for police, to find another way out? We don't know. What we know is that within minutes, Jihad Hughes, with his bags in his hands, opened the door and stepped outside. His mother was waiting. Laquandra Williams sat in her car. She had retrieved the handgun she kept there. As her son emerged from the apartment building, bags in hand, clearly leaving, she stepped out of the vehicle. Jihad wasn't facing her. He was walking away. His back was turned. He wasn't threatening anyone. He wasn't advancing toward his mother. He was doing exactly what most people would do in such a situation. Removing himself from danger, Williams raised the gun and fired, at close range. The bullet struck Jihad in the back. A neighbor looking out their window at that moment witnessed the shooting. They would later tell police what they saw. But perhaps the most damning evidence came from Williams herself. When police officers arrived at the scene, dispatchers logged their arrival at 1:50 p.m. Just 5 minutes after the initial call, they found Jihad Hughes lying on the ground outside the apartment building. He was unresponsive, suffering from a gunshot wound. And as officers began to secure the scene, Laquandra Williams approached them. Without prompting, without hesitation, she told them exactly what she had done. "I shot my son," she said. There was no ambiguity. No attempt to claim self-defense or accident. She told them she shot her son. She would later repeat this confession at police headquarters during formal questioning. Multiple witnesses had seen her shoot him. She had admitted to shooting him on the scene. She admitted it again to detectives. There was no mystery about who had killed Jihad Hughes. Officers and paramedics worked frantically. They provided aid at the scene, then rushed Jihad to Mount Carmel East Hospital. He arrived in critical condition, doctors and nurses fighting to save his life. But the wound was devastating. The damage was too severe. At 3:03 p.m., less than an hour and a half after his mother shot him in the back, Jihad Hughes was pronounced dead. He was 21 years old, a graduate, a soldier, a man of faith, a beloved uncle, a son. His life was over, and the person who ended it was the woman who had given him that life. The arrest of Laquandra Williams was swift and without incident. She was taken into custody at the scene, transported to the Fairfield County Jail. The charges were severe: aggravated murder, felony murder, and felonious assault. These weren't charges that suggested an accident or a momentary lapse in judgment. These were charges that reflected the deliberate nature of what had occurred. In the days following Jihad's death, social media became a window into the family's anguish. His sister Micaiah Adkins posted messages that revealed the impossible position the surviving children found themselves in. She had lost her brother, but she had also, in a sense, lost her mother. "I lost my brother and my mom," she wrote. The pain in those words is almost unbearable to read. How do you grieve both at once? How do you mourn a brother while knowing your mother is the reason he's gone? She continued, "If you're dealing with a mental illness, please go and get help. My brother didn't deserve to die behind the hands of our mother, not being in her right state of mind. And no, I'm not bashing my mother, because I've forgiven her for everything she's done. And she has tried to change, I've seen it. There's a complexity here that's important to understand. This daughter had clearly witnessed her mother's struggles, had seen her try to change. She still loved her mother even as she grieved her brother. But sometimes the devil, when you let him in, he takes over your mind. Then body," she wrote, trying to make sense of the senseless. And then she added something that speaks to the depth of what this family had endured. "He's a hero. He saved my sisters to no longer having to deal with this trauma. Finally, no more pain. Jihad, as a hero. Jihad's death in some terrible way, as a release for his siblings. These aren't words anyone should have to write about, their brother. But they suggest that the fear, the trauma, the systemic abuse his father referenced, these were real, ongoing, and terrifying. The family was also left with profound practical concerns. There were other children in that home. Williams had been their caregiver, their mother. Now she was in jail, charged with murder. The siblings who remained had to figure out how to move forward in the absence of both their brother and their mother. Laquandra Williams' first court appearance came quickly. She was advised of the charges against her, the most serious of which, murder, carried a potential sentence of life in prison. Her defense attorney, Peter Scranton, faced an almost impossible task. His client had confessed at the scene. She had confessed to detectives. There were multiple witnesses. There was no question about what happened, only the question of why. Scranton described Williams as being in shock, not fully processing what she had done. "She's upset," he said. "It's so new and raw, I don't think she's processed everything that's going on." He also indicated that Williams hoped to repair her relationship with her surviving children, though how one rebuilds after something like this is difficult to imagine. Initially, Williams' attorney indicated she would plead not guilty. Perhaps there would be arguments about her mental state, about diminished capacity, about the various factors that had led to this moment. A trial was scheduled for August 13th, 2020. But as the weeks passed, something changed. The prosecution, led by Fairfield County Prosecutor Kyle Witt, had an overwhelming case. The evidence was undeniable, and perhaps Williams herself, as the reality of what she'd done settled in, understood that there was no defense that could undo what had happened. On August 5th, 2024, before the trial could begin, LaQuandra Williams accepted a plea deal. She pleaded guilty to 1 count of murder with a 3-year firearm specification, and 1 count of felonious assault. The charges were serious, but they represented a resolution that avoided a trial that would have forced the surviving family members to relive the trauma in painful detail. The sentencing hearing was held shortly after Williams entered her guilty plea. It was a moment for the family to finally speak, to put into words what Jahad's death had meant to them. Jahad's father, J.D. Hughes, stood before the court. The man who had raised Jahad, who had watched him grow from a boy into a young man, who had seen him graduate and enlist and embrace his faith. J.D.'s statement was direct and devastating. He made it clear that he did not view what happened as an accident or a tragedy in the traditional sense. This was murder. And it was the culmination of something that had been building for years. What happened to my son on February 19th, 2024? When he was pronounced dead, the victim of a gunshot wound that entered his back at the hands of his mother, was no accident, he said. Jihad's murder was the result of years of systemic abuse that spiraled out of control. Systemic abuse. Years. Spiraled out of control. These words painted a picture of a family living in chronic fear, of a young man who had endured more than anyone outside that home could fully understand. Jihad's brother and 2 sisters also gave statements, each one adding their voice to the chorus of grief, each one trying to express the magnitude of what had been lost. A brother, a son, an uncle, a man who had been trying to do the right things, build the right life, be the right person. Prosecutor Kyle Witt addressed the court as well. No sentence imposed by the court will fill the void left by the senseless murder of Jahad Hughes at his mother's hand. He said, but LaQuandra Williams has been held to answer for her crimes, and justice was served here today when she was sentenced to life in prison. The judge, Richard E. Behrens of the Fairfield County Court of Common Pleas, handed down the sentence. LaQuandra Williams was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 18 years. The firearm specification added 3 years to be served consecutively. She was also convicted of felonious assault, with its own life sentence with parole eligibility after 15 years. To run concurrently. In practical terms, Williams will be at least 62 years old before she can even be considered for parole. By the time she could potentially walk free, her son would have been 39 years old if he had lived. Williams was immediately remanded to the custody of the Fairfield County Sheriff and would be transported to the Ohio Department of Rehabilitation and Corrections to begin serving her sentence. Even with a conviction, even with a sentence, Jahad Hughes' death leaves behind more questions than answers. The most fundamental one is simply why. What happened inside that apartment in the months and years before February 19th? What was the nature of the abuse his father referenced? What had driven Williams to such a horrific act? Authorities never released details about what sparked the argument that afternoon. Was it something specific? Was it the culmination of ongoing tensions? We may never know. What we do know is that it escalated with terrifying speed, from a verbal confrontation to an attempted stabbing to a shooting. Jahad's sister had referenced mental illness in her social media posts. She suggested that her mother wasn't in her right mind, that the family had been aware of her struggles, that Williams had tried to change. This raises profound questions about access to mental health care. about the systems in place to help families in crisis, about the warning signs that might have been missed or ignored. Could Jahad's death have been prevented? If Williams was struggling with mental illness, were there interventions that could have helped? Were there resources the family could have accessed? Or was the system failing them long before that February afternoon? We know that Jahad was trying to leave. He had packed his bags. He was walking out of that apartment, presumably to somewhere safer. If he had managed to get away, if someone had stopped his mother, if the timeline had been just slightly different, would he be alive today? These are the kinds of questions that haunt survivors of violence, the endless what-ifs that can never be answered. In the wake of his death, those who knew Jahad Hughes tried to capture who he had been in life. Not just how he died. The obituaries and tributes painted a picture of a young man who was gentle, faithful, and devoted to his family. He was remembered as someone who loved God and gospel music, who found meaning in worship and community. He was remembered as a graduate who had chosen to serve his country. He was remembered as an uncle who had been a father figure to his nephew, who had shown up day after day to be present in that child's life. His sister called him a hero, not because of some grand act, but because his death, as terrible as it was, had somehow freed his siblings from ongoing trauma. That's an impossibly heavy burden for anyone to carry in memory. To be remembered not just for who you were, but for what your death meant to those you left behind. At his funeral, held at God's Way Power of Love Ministry, the church where he had worshipped, people gathered to mourn. The service was a celebration of his life, but also an acknowledgement of the senselessness of his death. How do you eulogize someone who was killed by their own mother? How do you comfort a family torn apart in such an unnatural way? His father, J.D., had to bury his son. His siblings had to say goodbye to their brother. His nephew, Malachi, lost the father figure who had been so important to him. And they all had to do this knowing that the person responsible was someone who should have protected him above all others. Jahad Hughes' death is part of a broader, deeply troubling phenomenon. Familial homicide. When parents kill their children, a crime sometimes called filicide. It represents one of the most fundamental violations of natural order. Parents are supposed to protect, nurture, and care for their children. When that relationship inverts, when the protector becomes the killer, it shakes our understanding of family itself. Studies of filicide show that it often occurs in context of mental illness, severe stress, or long-term family dysfunction. Sometimes there are warning signs, previous violence, substance abuse, documented mental health crises. Other times, as may have been the case here, the violence happens behind closed doors, known to family members but hidden from outsiders. The fact that Jahad's father described years of systemic abuse suggests this family had been suffering in ways that were not visible to the broader community. Neighbors may have had no idea. Teachers, co-workers, church members. They may have seen a family that seemed normal on the surface while underneath something terrible was festering. This is one of the most difficult aspects of family violence. It's invisibility. Victims often feel trapped by loyalty, by shame, by fear of what will happen if they speak out. Jahad was an adult, but that didn't make leaving easy. He lived with his mother and siblings. Leaving meant abandoning his younger siblings to whatever he had been protecting them from. It's possible he stayed as long as he did precisely because he was trying to shield them. The day he finally decided to leave, the day he packed his bags and walked toward the door, was the day his mother killed him. Today, LaQuandra Williams sits in an Ohio prison. She will be there for at least 18 years, possibly for the rest of her life. She has time to think about what she did, about the son she killed, about the family she destroyed, whether she has found peace, whether she has truly grasped the magnitude of her actions. We cannot know. Her surviving children must move forward without their brother and without their mother. They must process trauma that most people cannot imagine. They must reconcile their love for both their mother and their brother with the fact that one killed the other. They must somehow build lives that are not defined entirely by that February afternoon. Jahad's father, J.D., must live the rest of his life knowing that his son was murdered by the woman he once loved, the woman with whom he built a family. He must carry the knowledge that the abuse he described in court, abuse he clearly knew about, culminated in his son's death. That burden is almost impossible to contemplate. And young Malachi, the nephew who lost his uncle and father figure, must grow up with the knowledge of how Jahad died. He will have to make sense of this tragedy as he matures. as he processes what family means when family can be so dangerous. The murder of Jihad Hughes is not a story with easy answers or clear lessons. It is simply a tragedy. A young man with his whole life ahead of him was shot in the back by his own mother and died before he turned 22. A family was shattered in ways that can never be fully repaired, and the community of Reynoldsburg, Ohio, had to grapple with the knowledge that such horror could happen in their quiet suburb, in an ordinary apartment complex, on an ordinary Monday afternoon. If there is anything to take from Jihad's story, it might be this. Abuse in families is real. It is often hidden, and it can be deadly. When people speak about systemic abuse, when they reference years of trauma, when they say someone wasn't in their right mind, these are not excuses, they are explanations, and they are warnings. Families in crisis need help. People struggling with mental illness need support. And those living in fear inside their own homes need to know there are ways out. Resources available, people who will believe them and help them. Jihad tried to leave. He packed his bags. He walked out the door, but he was 5 minutes too late. 5 minutes between packing a bag and being shot. 5 minutes between escape and death. 5 minutes that changed everything. We cannot give Jihad those 5 minutes back. We cannot undo what happened on Drew Heights Place. We cannot restore him to his family, to his nephew, to the life he was trying to build. All we can do is remember him. Remember who he was. Quiet, faithful, kind. A man trying to do right by his family, by his faith, by himself. And remember how he died. Shot in the back while trying to escape. Killed by the person who should have loved him most in the world. May Jihad Hughes rest in peace. May his family find healing. And may we, as a society, do better to protect those living in fear inside their own homes. In the months since Jihad's death, his family has tried to maintain his memory in meaningful ways. They gather to remember the good times, the gospel music, the time with Malachi, the quiet moments of faith and family. They have forgiven, at least in part, though forgiveness doesn't erase the pain. LaQuandra Williams remains incarcerated, serving her sentence. In 18 years, she will have the opportunity to plead her case for parole. Whether she will be granted freedom, whether the parole board will believe she no longer poses a danger, remains to be seen. But even if she is eventually released, she will be released into a world without her son, into a family that has been forever changed by what she did. The apartment on Drew Heights Place no longer houses the Hughes family. Too many memories, too much pain. The other residents of the complex have moved on, though some surely remember that February afternoon, the sound of a gunshot, the sight of a young man lying on the ground. Tussing Elementary School still stands nearby, children still walking to and from school, unaware of the tragedy that unfolded just down the street. Life, as it always does, has continued. But for those who love Jihad Hughes, life will never be quite the same. This was his story. This was his death, and this is how we remember him. Not just as a victim, but as a person, a son, a brother, an uncle, a soldier, a man of faith. Jihad Hughes, 21 years old, gone far too soon, killed by the one who brought him into the world. May he rest in eternal peace. Please, if you're still awake, let's move on to our last story. Story 5. Tonight we're going to explore a story that shook a small Lancashire town and eventually changed the way an entire nation views prejudice and difference. This is the story of Sophie Lancaster, a young woman whose life was cut tragically short, not because of anything she said or did, but simply because of how she chose to express herself. This story, while heartbreaking, is one that needs to be told, not to disturb your rest, but to honor a memory and perhaps in the quiet of the night, to reflect on what it means to truly accept one another. Take a deep breath, and let's begin. Sophie Louise Lancaster was born on November 26, 1986, in the small town of Haslingden, Lancashire, England. Lancashire is a place of rolling hills, old mill towns, and tight-knit communities where everyone seems to know everyone else. It's the kind of place where tradition runs deep, where conformity is often more comfortable than standing out. But Sophie was never one for conformity. From an early age, Sophie showed a creative spirit that couldn't be contained. She attended Stonefold Primary School, and later Haslingden High School. where she was known as bright, sensitive, and thoughtful. Her family described her as having a social conscience even as a young girl. She cared deeply about fairness, about justice, about people who didn't fit in. As Sophie grew older, she began to develop her own unique style. While other teenagers in Baccape and Rossendale were following mainstream fashion trends, Sophie was drawn to something different. She discovered the Gothic subculture, a world of dark clothing, dramatic makeup, and music that spoke to the outcasts and the dreamers. She dyed her hair in vibrant colors, eventually settling on striking red dreadlocks that cascaded down her shoulders. She adorned herself with over 20 piercings in her ears, along with facial piercings and others that marked her as someone who lived by her own rules. Her mother, Sylvia Lancaster, would later describe how Sophie developed this look organically. She wore a full-length black leather coat and dyed her hair black. Sylvia remembered, it was just what she was. She'd always been different, a bit of an outsider, but Sophie was so much more than her appearance. She was funny and kind, with a quick wit that could make anyone laugh. She was brave, the kind of person who would stand up for others, who wouldn't back down when she believed in something. She loved to read, immersing herself in books and ideas. She listened to music with the kind of passion that only young people seem to possess, attending live shows and losing herself in the sound. At the time of her death, Sophie was on a gap year. She had plans, big plans. She wanted to attend Accrington and Rossendale College to study for an English degree. She dreamed of becoming either a journalist or a youth worker, professions that would allow her to help others, to give voice to those who felt unheard. Sophie wanted to make a difference in the world. In 2005, Sophie met someone who understood her completely. His name was Robert Maltby. Robert was 21 years old, an art student from Manchester with his own creative vision and alternative style. Like Sophie, he didn't fit the mold of what a young man from Lancashire was supposed to look like. He wore makeup sometimes, had a lip piercing, and dressed in ways that made him stand out in their small town. They met through mutual friends, and the connection was immediate. They both loved the same music, shared the same values, and understood what it was like to be viewed as other in a place where being different often meant being a target. In an interview years later, Robert would describe their relationship with a quiet fondness. We'd see friends at weekends, but day to day it was just the two of us, he said. They were a solitary couple in many ways, content in each other's company, creating their own world away from the judgment of others. By 2007, Sophie and Robert had been together for about 2 years. They had moved in together on King Street in Baccape, sharing a flat and building a life. They talked about the future, about university, about careers, about possibly getting married someday. Just a month before the attack that would change everything, they had discussed marriage seriously for the first time. But their relationship wasn't without challenges. Living as they did, looking as they did, in a small Lancashire town, meant dealing with prejudice regularly. People would stare. They'd hear whispers, sometimes shouts. There were incidents, small ones that they tried to brush off, that they didn't report to police or even tell their families about. In fact, Sophie's mother would later reveal something heartbreaking. Sophie and Rob had actually been attacked 3 times previously, but they didn't report it. They didn't tell me. They didn't tell the police. 3 times. 3 times before the night that would take Sophie's life. They had been targeted, attacked, hurt simply for being themselves. And 3 times they had stayed silent, perhaps hoping it would stop, perhaps not wanting to worry their families, perhaps thinking that this was just the price they had to pay for refusing to change who they were. They remained defiant. They remained free-spirited. They never changed their appearance, never dimmed their light to make others more comfortable. And on the night of August 10th, 2007, that defiance would have devastating consequences. August 10th, 2007 was an ordinary Friday evening in Baccape. Sophie and Robert had spent the evening at a friend's house in Britannia, a suburb of the town, watching television and enjoying each other's company. They'd been drinking a bit. Nothing excessive, just the kind of casual drinking that young people often do when they're relaxed and having fun. Around 11:40 p.m., they decided it was time to head home. It was a warm summer night, the kind where the air still holds the day's heat even as darkness settles in. They walked through the quiet streets, talking and laughing, completely unaware that this ordinary walk home would become anything but ordinary. On their way, they stopped at a petrol station on Market Street. Sophie wanted to buy cigarettes. It was a routine stop, the kind you make without thinking twice. While they were on the forecourt of the petrol station, something happened that seemed harmless at the time. A group of teenagers approached them. 5 boys ranging in age from 15 to 17. Among them were Ryan Herbert, who was 16, and Brendan Harris, who was 15. The others were Joseph Holm, his brother Danny Holm, and Daniel Mallet. The boys struck up a conversation. They seemed friendly enough at first, just kids hanging out on a summer night. They invited Sophie and Robert to join them at a place the locals called the Fudge Factory, and then suggested they all head to the skate park area of Stubbly Park. Sophie and Robert exchanged glances. In that moment, they made a decision that would haunt everyone who loved them. They agreed to go. As they walked to the park, Robert would later say that something felt off. When we got there, I thought, oh God, I don't like these people at all, he recalled. I just wanted to leave. But before they could leave, before they could trust that instinct that was telling them something was wrong, the night turned violent. The time was approximately 1:10 a.m. on August 11th. What happened next in Stubbly Park was described by the judge who would eventually sentence the attackers as feral thuggery and behavior that degrades humanity itself. Without any provocation, without any argument or confrontation, the group of boys suddenly turned on Robert Maltby. Brendan Harris struck first, landing a punch to Robert's head that sent him reeling. Then the others joined in. They descended on him like a pack, kicking him from every angle. He tried to protect himself, tried to fight back, but there were too many of them. They kicked him in the head, in the body, over and over again. Within moments, Robert collapsed to the ground. Unconscious, Sophie screamed. "Get off him," she cried. "Stop." She did what instinct told her to do. She threw herself between Robert and his attackers. She dropped to the ground beside him, cradling his head in her lap, trying to shield him from the blows that kept coming. Tears streamed down her face as she begged them to stop, to leave him alone. But the boys didn't stop. They told Sophie to move. She refused. She wouldn't leave Robert's side, wouldn't abandon him even as the danger to herself became clear. And then they turned their violence toward her. Ryan Herbert kicked Sophie with such force that she flew backward, hitting the ground hard. Before she could recover, both Herbert and Brendan Harris began attacking her. They kicked her head from opposing sides simultaneously. They jumped up and down on her skull with their full weight. One witness, a 15-year-old girl watching in horror, would later tell police. They were running over and just kicking her in the head and jumping up and down on her head. Herbert delivered one final stomp to Sophie's skull, a blow so powerful that it left the imprint of his trainer on her face. By the time they stopped, both Sophie and Robert lay unconscious on the ground, their faces so swollen and disfigured that when emergency services arrived, the paramedics couldn't tell which victim was male and which was female. The boys walked away from the scene as if nothing significant had happened. When they encountered another teenager shortly after, witnesses described them as behaving in a giddy way, hyperactive and bouncing around doing silly things. They were boasting about what they'd done. Herbert told someone, "You want to see them, they are a right mess." During police questioning, Harris was described as laughing and joking about the attack with his mother present. These weren't hardened criminals. They were teenagers, children, really, who had just committed an act of such savage brutality that it defied comprehension, and they seemed to think it was funny. Emergency services received a call at 1:15 a.m. The caller was a 14-year-old girl who had witnessed the attack. Her voice on the recording was desperate, panicked. We need an ambulance at Backup Park. This Mosher has just been banged because he's a Mosher." Even in her panic, even as she called for help, the language she used reflected the dehumanization that had led to the attack. Sophie and Robert weren't people in that moment. They were mushers, a derogatory term for those who dressed alternatively. Paramedics arrived to a scene of horror. Both victims were unconscious, their injuries severe. Sophie and Robert were rushed to hospital immediately. Robert Maltby was taken to intensive care with internal bleeding and severe head trauma. He was placed in a medically induced coma. The doctors weren't sure he would survive. His family kept vigil at his bedside, praying, hoping, waiting. After a week, Robert opened his eyes. He had survived, though the road to recovery would be long and painful. The attack had left him with serious brain damage, injuries that would affect him for the rest of his life. When he regained consciousness, his first thought, his only thought, was Sophie. "All I wanted to do was go and see Sophie," he later said. But Sophie's condition was far worse. She had been transferred to Fairfield General Hospital in Barry, then moved to the neurology unit at Hope Hospital in Salford, as doctors tried desperately to save her life. But the damage to her brain was catastrophic. The blows to her head had been so severe, so repeated, so vicious, that there was nothing the doctors could do. Sophie Lancaster lay in a deep coma, machines breathing for her, her family gathered around her bed, her mother Sylvia, her father John, her brother Adam. They held her hands, talked to her, prayed for a miracle that wouldn't come. For 13 days, Sophie fought. For 13 days, her family hoped. For 13 days, the nation watched and waited, horrified by what had happened in that park and back. But on August 24th, 2007, the doctors told the Lancaster family what they had feared. Sophie would never regain consciousness. The damage was too extensive. Their beautiful daughter, their funny, brave, kind Sophie, was gone. The family made the most difficult decision any parent can make. They agreed to turn off life support. Sophie Lancaster died on August 24th, 2007, 13 days after the attack. She was 20 years old. Lancashire police launched a major investigation immediately. They knew from witness statements that up to 15 people had been in Stubbley Park that night, though not all had participated in the attack. The park was a popular hangout spot for local teenagers. The police worked tirelessly, interviewing more than 100 people, piecing together what had happened in those terrible minutes. And as they investigated, a clear picture emerged. Sophie Lancaster and Robert Maltby had been targeted for one reason, and one reason only. They looked different. The police identified the Gothic dress of the couple as the primary motivation for the attack. This wasn't a robbery. There was no prior conflict. Sophie and Robert hadn't said or done anything to provoke violence. They had simply been walking home, being themselves, and that had been enough to make them targets. 5 teenagers were arrested and charged. Ryan Herbert, 16. Brendan Harris, 15. Joseph Holm, 17. His younger brother Danny Holm, 16. And Daniel Mallet, 17. They were believed to be members of a gang that called itself the Backup Terror Group. When investigators looked into the backgrounds of these boys, disturbing patterns emerged. Both Herbert and Harris regularly smoked cannabis. They'd been in trouble before. 4 months prior to the attack on Sophie and Robert, both boys had received convictions for assaulting and stamping on another 16-year-old boy in the same park. They had done this before, and they would do it again. Initially, all 5 were charged with grievous bodily harm with intent. But when Sophie died, the charges were upgraded. On September 6, 2007, all 5 boys were charged with murder at Burnley Youth Court. The case proceeded to Preston Crown Court. The preliminary hearing was held on October 31, 2007. At a hearing on December 14th, all 5 accused pleaded not guilty to both murder and grievous bodily harm. But as the trial date approached, cracks began to appear in their united front. The trial began on March 10, 2008, at Preston Crown Court. The nation watched, the Gothic community watched, and Sophie's family sat in the courtroom, day after day, listening to the horrific details of what had been done to their daughter. On the first day of the trial, there were dramatic developments. All 5 boys changed their pleas regarding the assault on Robert Maltby. They all now admitted to grievous bodily harm with intent, but the murder charges were another matter. Ryan Herbert stood and pleaded guilty to the murder of Sophie Lancaster. At 16 years old, he admitted in court that he had killed her. Brendan Harris pleaded not guilty to murder. He would stand trial. The murder charges against the other 3, Joseph Holm, Danny Holm, and Daniel Mallet, were dropped. They would be sentenced for the attack on Robert, but not for Sophie's death. Over the next 2 weeks, the jury heard testimony that was difficult to listen to. Witnesses described the attack in detail. The recorded emergency call was played in court. The extent of Sophie and Robert's injuries was documented clinically. Without emotion, but the horror was impossible to miss. The prosecution made their case clear. Sophie and Robert were singled out not for anything they had said or done, but because they looked and dressed differently. This was a hate crime. This was murder based on nothing more than prejudice, intolerance, and the inability to accept that someone else might choose to live differently. On March 27, 2008, the jury returned with their verdict. Brendan Harris was found guilty of murder. For the first time, the judge allowed the names of both Harris and Herbert, which had been withheld during the trial because they were minors, to be made public. The nation now knew who had killed Sophie Lancaster. On April 28, 2008, Judge Anthony Russell QC delivered his sentencing remarks. They were scathing, powerful, and would be quoted for years to come. This was a terrible case which has shocked and outraged all who have heard about it. Judge Russell began. This is a case which I believe has shocked not only those who know the area, but the nation as a whole. He described the attack as feral thuggery that raised serious questions about the sort of society which exists in this country. Then he said something that would resonate deeply. At least wild animals, when they hunt in packs, have a legitimate reason for so doing, to obtain food. You have none, and your behavior on that night degrades humanity itself. Ryan Herbert, who had pleaded guilty, was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 16 years, and 3 months before he could be considered for parole. Brendan Harris, found guilty after trial, was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 18 years. The 3 others received indeterminate sentences. Joseph and Danny Holm were sentenced to a minimum of 5 years and 10 months each. Daniel Mallett received a minimum of 4 years and 4 months. As the sentences were read, the boys showed no emotion. They were led away from the dock, back to cells, to begin serving their time. Outside the courtroom, Sophie's mother, Sylvia, spoke to the press. Her voice was steady, but the pain was evident. No sentence could ever be enough, she said. My daughter's last moments on earth must have been a living hell. Not only did she witness Robert being kicked and stamped upon, but she died not knowing whether Robert lived or died after the vicious attack on him. Detective Superintendent Mick Gradwell of Lancashire Police gave his assessment. I do not think Herbert and Harris recognized how violent the attack was. They seemed to have enjoyed it. It was one of the most violent murders he had encountered in his entire career. Sophie's funeral was held in Whitworth, Lancashire. More than 300 people attended, including television news crews. The Gothic community came out in force, wearing their blacks and their colors, refusing to be intimidated, honoring one of their own. Robert Maltby attended, though he was still recovering from his own injuries. In an interview years later, he described that day with heartbreaking clarity. My initial memory was seeing the coffin and thinking, that's too small. Her entire life shouldn't have fitted into that small box. That's when I began to crumble. And I'll be honest, I was resentful of the fact that so many people were there. They had the best intentions, but I was thinking, did you ever eat a meal with her? Did you know how she took her coffee? You just saw this archetype on the news. You didn't know her. It was a raw, honest expression of grief from someone who had lost not just his girlfriend, but a piece of himself. As Robert physically recovered from his injuries, the mental and emotional toll became clear. He struggled with depression. He found it difficult to immediately visit Sophie's grave. The trauma of that night haunted him, shaped him, became an inescapable part of his identity. I try my best to be Robert Maltby, the artist, he said in an interview 10 years later. But sometimes it's difficult to not remember about Robert Maltby, the victim of a horrific attack with a dead girlfriend. He eventually finished his illustration degree in 2016. He moved on with his life as best he could, entering a new relationship, making plans to pursue his art internationally. He moved away from the Gothic style that had defined his younger years. Though he was clear that this wasn't about shame, it was about survival, about creating some distance from the trauma. Robert has been vocal about one thing in particular. He doesn't see what happened to Sophie as primarily a hate crime against Goths. I have never seen it as a hate crime, he said. It was always like Sophie Lancaster was killed because she was a Goth. No, she wasn't. She was killed because some arseholes killed her. He argued that focusing solely on the Gothic aspect was an oversimplification of a much broader social issue. Why can't we ask what it is about them that made them want to murder someone? He asked. Not what it is about someone that made them be murdered. It's a powerful point. One that challenges us to think not just about victims and their differences, but about perpetrators and what creates such hatred in the first place. In the days and weeks following Sophie's death, Sylvia Lancaster sat at her daughter's bedside and made a decision. She had seen firsthand the abuse and prejudice Sophie had endured simply for being different. She had watched her vibrant, loving daughter fight for her life, and lose that fight because of intolerance and hatred. Originally, Sylvia had imagined that when Sophie recovered, because she had to believe Sophie would recover, they would go into schools together, They would talk to young people about difference, about acceptance, about the importance of being yourself, and letting others do the same. When Sophie died, Sylvia decided to carry on that work alone. On what would have been Sophie's 21st birthday, the first Make a Noise event was held in her honor. The idea was simple but powerful. Instead of a moment of silence, they would celebrate Sophie with noise, with music, with life, with the kind of energy Sophie herself had brought to the world. The event became an annual tradition. On October 20th, 2008, Sylvia officially founded the Sophie Lancaster Foundation. It became a registered charity on May 18th, 2009. The foundation's mission can be summed up in one acronym: SOPA. Stamp out prejudice, hatred, and intolerance everywhere. The foundation had three main objectives. First, to create a lasting legacy to Sophie, ensuring she would never be forgotten. Second, to challenge intolerance against the alternative community through education. Third, to campaign for changes in the law, to classify violence against members of alternative subcultures as hate crimes. Sylvia worked tirelessly. She spoke at schools, educating children about the importance of tolerance and celebrating individuality. She engaged with music festivals, prisons, police services, and social services. She became a powerful voice for change, transforming her grief into action. One teacher, after having Sylvia speak at their school, said, "In my 13 years of teaching, I have never seen a reaction from children like that." The foundation gained patrons from the arts and entertainment world, including poet Simon Armitage, comedian Robin Ince, actress Juliette Landau, and actress Vicky McClure. Julie Hesman-Hogg, who would later portray Sylvia in a BBC drama about Sophie's murder, also became involved with the foundation's work. Perhaps the foundation's most significant achievement came in April 2013, when Greater Manchester Police officially began recording offences committed against goths and members of other alternative subcultures as hate crimes. The same classification used for crimes based on race, disability, or sexual orientation. They were the first police force in the United Kingdom to do so, setting a precedent that other forces would eventually follow. It was a victory, a recognition that prejudice takes many forms and must be challenged in all of them. In recognition of her work, Sylvia Lancaster was awarded an OBE Order of the British Empire in 2014 for community cohesion, especially in the reduction of hate crime. Sylvia continued her work for 15 years, never stopping, never giving up. But on April 12, 2022, just weeks after learning that one of Sophie's killers would be released from prison, Sylvia Lancaster passed away suddenly, and unexpectedly. She was buried alongside her daughter. The foundation continues its work today, carrying on Sylvia's legacy, ensuring that Sophie's name and the principles she stood for will never be forgotten. In February 2020, news broke that shocked many who had followed the case. Ryan Herbert's minimum jail term had been reduced. A high court judge concluded that Herbert had made exceptional progress in prison. His minimum term was cut from 16 years and 3 months to 14.5 years. Sophie's family was devastated. Sylvia released a statement, expressing her disappointment. "Once again, we have a justice system that fails to deliver justice. However much progress people make in prison, they have been given their sentence in recognition of the extent of their crime," she continued, describing the attack in terms that left no room for misunderstanding. The judge at the murder trial described the attack on Sophie as feral, with the attacker's behavior savage and merciless. Her injuries were so severe, the paramedics attending the scene could not facially distinguish if she were male or female. "How can you bear knowing the reality of the level of violence my daughter was subjected to, and stack that up against reducing the minimum tariff, because they have done well in prison?" She ended with words that captured the reality of being a victim's family. "Her attackers may not have been given a life sentence, but I have." In March 2022, the parole board made its decision. After considering the circumstances of Herbert's offending and examining the evidence for his progress in custody, the panel decided that Ryan Herbert was suitable for release. The statement from the parole board noted that Herbert had made significant changes to his life, which reflected his remorse, his insight, and increased maturity. His behavior in prison had initially been poor, but it changed once he moved into an adult facility. He had participated in rehabilitation programs. He had, by all accounts, changed. Ryan Herbert was released from prison in 2022. 15 years after he murdered Sophie Lancaster, he is now subject to license conditions that will remain in place for the rest of his life, with restrictions on his movements. living arrangements, and associations. Brendan Harris, who was found guilty after trial rather than pleading guilty, received a longer minimum sentence. He remains in prison as of this recording. The three others involved in the attack served their sentences and have been released. They returned to their lives, carrying with them the knowledge of what they did that night in Stubbley Park. Sophie's story has resonated far beyond the borders of Lancashire. It has inspired art, music, plays, films, and books. It has sparked conversations about prejudice, about youth violence, about the kind of society we want to build. In 2010, Robert Maltby held an exhibition of his art at Affleck's Palace in Manchester, featuring 15 paintings inspired by Sophie. It was his way of honoring her memory, of transforming grief into something beautiful. In 2017, on the 10th anniversary of Sophie's murder, the BBC released a film called Murdered for Being Different, created in close collaboration with Robert, his family, Sophie's family, and the police investigation team. The drama told the story of Sophie and Robert's relationship and the violence that destroyed it. The film was praised for its sensitive handling of the material and won a BAFTA award. Poet Simon Armitage created a sequence of poems about Sophie's life and death, giving voice to Sylvia's grief and Sophie's memory. In 2021, the popular British soap opera Coronation Street featured a storyline inspired by Sophie's murder. With input from Sylvia Lancaster and the Foundation, the show depicted a hate crime against a Gothic character named Nina Lucas and her boyfriend Seb Franklin, who died from his injuries. The storyline brought Sophie's story to millions of viewers, raising awareness about hate crimes against alternative subcultures. Music festivals across the UK honor Sophie's memory. Bloodstock Festival named a stage after her, ensuring that every year thousands of people in the alternative community gather and celebrate the kind of individuality Sophie represented. The case has been compared to the 1997 murder of Brian Denecke in the United States, another young man from an alternative subculture who was killed by those who viewed him as different. These cases remind us that this kind of prejudice is not limited to one place, one time, or one culture. It's a human problem that requires a human solution. So what do we take from Sophie Lancaster's story as we settle into sleep tonight? Perhaps it's this. Sophie Lancaster was murdered because she was different, but she was also celebrated because she was different. She lived authentically, refusing to dim her light to make others comfortable. She loved deeply. She stood up for her boyfriend even when it put her in danger. She had dreams and plans and a future that was stolen from her. Her death was senseless, brutal, and wrong. But her life had meaning. Her life had purpose, and through the work of her mother, through the foundation that bears her name, through the countless people who have been educated about tolerance and acceptance, Sophie's life continues to have impact. Every time someone chooses kindness over cruelty, every time someone stands up for someone who looks different, every time a young person learns that it's okay to be yourself, that's Sophie's legacy. Robert Maltby survived that night in Stubbley Park, but he survived with scars both visible and invisible. He has spoken powerfully about his experience, about the complexity of being forever associated with a tragedy, about the challenge of moving forward while carrying the weight of the past. The 5 boys who attacked Sophie and Robert were children themselves, teenagers whose capacity for violence shocked everyone who knew them. They serve as a reminder that hate is often learned, that prejudice can be taught, and that we all have a responsibility to teach something better. Sylvia Lancaster spent the last 15 years of her life fighting the kind of hatred that took her daughter. She educated thousands of children. She changed laws. She made the world a better place, even though her own world had been shattered. And when she died in 2022, she left behind a foundation that continues that work. The Sophie Lancaster Foundation operates on the principle that education is key. They believe that by teaching young people to respect differences and celebrate individuality, they can prevent future tragedies. They work in schools, in communities, in prisons, anywhere they can spread their message. Sophie would have been nearly 40 years old now. She might have become that journalist or youth worker she dreamed of being. She might have married Robert, might have had a family, might have written books or changed lives in ways we can only imagine. Instead, she became a symbol, and perhaps that's not what she would have wanted. Perhaps she would have preferred to live quietly, to pursue her dreams, to simply be Sophie. But symbols matter. Movements matter. The work that her mother did, that the foundation continues to do, it matters. Because somewhere tonight there's a young person who dresses differently, who listens to different music, who expresses themselves in ways that make them stand out. And because of Sophie Lancaster's story, because of the education and awareness that has followed, maybe that young person is a little bit safer. Maybe someone who might have mocked them or hurt them has learned to pause, to think, to choose compassion instead. That's Sophie's legacy. So as you drift off to sleep tonight, remember Sophie Louise Lancaster. Remember her kindness, her bravery, her refusal to be anyone but herself. Remember that she died doing what was right, protecting someone she loved, refusing to abandon him even in the face of violence. Remember that difference is not a threat. It's a gift. It makes our world richer, more interesting, more beautiful. And remember that each of us has a choice every single day to stand against hatred, to choose acceptance, to make noise for those who can no longer speak for themselves. Rest in peace, Sophie Lancaster. Born November 26, 1986. Died August 24, 2007. Gone far too soon, but never ever forgot. Thank you for listening to tonight's true crime story. Rest peacefully knowing that another story awaits you next time, ready to accompany you on another journey toward restorative sleep. But if you're still awake, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories. And until next time, stay safe and take care. Good night.